At my luxury Napa Valley wedding, I caught my golden child brother slipping a dissolving pill into my champagne glass. I did not scream or cause a scene. I used the reflection of a polished silver serving tray to watch his every move. Then I smoothly swapped our drinks. He smirked at me, completely unaware that his own public destruction was 50 minutes away. I am Sydney, 33 years old, and I work as a cybersecurity consultant. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought they were untouchable. The evening air in Napa Valley was crisp and smelled faintly of crushed grapes and expensive perfume. Fairy lights were strung across ancient oak trees, casting a warm golden glow over the sprawling estate we had rented for the reception. My husband Jason, a 34-year-old corporate lawyer, was across the terrace laughing with some of the senior partners from his firm. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The music from the string quartet floated through the crowd, mingling with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy guests networking. From my seat at the sweetheart table, I watched my 36-year-old brother Derek navigate the crowd. Derek was the manager of a cryptocurrency hedge fund and the undisputed golden child of our family. He was wearing a custom Italian suit that probably cost more than my first car, loudly bragging about his latest digital asset acquisitions to anyone who would listen. He had spent the entire evening handing out business cards to Jason's high-profile colleagues, treating my wedding reception like his own personal networking event. In my line of work as a cybersecurity consultant, you are trained to monitor environments for unauthorized access, behavioral shifts, and hidden threats. You learn to spot anomalies. Derek voluntarily offering to go to the bar to fetch me a fresh glass of champagne was a massive anomaly. My brother never did anything for anyone unless it served his own interests. He had not lifted a finger to help with the wedding preparations, yet suddenly he was playing the role of the doting older brother. I stood up, pretending to adjust the heavy lace on the skirt of my wedding gown. A waiter had recently cleared some appetizer plates, leaving behind a large, highly polished silver serving tray on a nearby side table. I positioned myself so I could see the reflection of the bar area behind me perfectly. In the curved silver surface, I watched Derek approach the bartender and take 2 tall flutes of champagne. Instead of walking straight back to me, he took a slight detour behind a towering floral arrangement. He turned his back to the crowd, creating a small blind spot. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, but my training kept my breathing steady. I watched the reflection intently. Derek reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. His hand hovered over the glass on the left. I saw the distinct motion of his fingers dropping something small and white into the bubbling liquid. It fizzed slightly and dissolved almost instantly, leaving the champagne looking completely untouched. A cold wave of realization washed over me. He was drugging my drink. My mind raced through the possibilities. Confronting him right now would cause a massive scene. Derek would deny it, feign outrage, and play the victim. Our parents would immediately rush to his defense, accusing me of being paranoid and ruining my own wedding day with my supposed dramatic delusions. They had spent over 3 decades protecting his image and dismissing my concerns. A public confrontation would only give him exactly what he wanted: an excuse to label me as unstable. Instead, I chose to treat my brother like a piece of malicious software. I would let him breach the outer firewall, track his payload, and redirect it right back to the source. Derek walked back to the sweetheart table with his signature arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He set the 2 glasses down on the pristine white tablecloth. The poisoned glass was placed carefully on the left, directly in front of my chair. The untainted glass was placed on the right, near where he planned to stand for his upcoming toast. "I have to go say hello to the managing partner of Jason's firm," Derek said smoothly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Be right back, little sister. Do not start the toast without me." He turned and strode away enthusiastically, greeting a wealthy tech investor who had just walked through the terrace doors. The moment his broad shoulders turned away from me, I made my move. I did not hesitate. I did not look around nervously. With smooth, calculated precision, I reached out and slid the glass on the left over to the right side of the table. I took the glass on the right and placed it directly in front of my own chair. The swap took less than 2 seconds. The glasses were identical, the liquid inside indistinguishable. I sat down, smoothed the fabric of my dress over my lap, and folded my hands. The adrenaline was coursing through my veins, but outwardly, I was the picture of a serene, happy bride. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. I was no longer the helpless younger sister, constantly overshadowed and undermined by the family favorite. I was the architect of the system, and I had just rewritten the code. A few minutes later, Derek strutted back to the table, his chest puffed out with self-importance. He took his place beside me, his eyes gleaming with a predatory excitement that sent chills down my spine. He reached out and wrapped his fingers firmly around the stem of the glass on the right. He was holding the poisoned glass, entirely unaware that he was gripping his own downfall. A sharp ringing chime cut through the ambient chatter of the reception. Derek was tapping a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The low hum of conversations faded as guests turned their attention toward the sweetheart table. Jason slid into the empty chair beside me, his warmth a stark contrast to the cold calculation currently running through my mind. Derek loved an audience. He adjusted his stance, ensuring the vineyard lighting hit his profile perfectly before he began. "If I could have everyone's attention," he announced, his voice projecting with the practiced ease of a man used to pitching millions to hedge fund investors. "I want to propose a toast to my little sister Sydney and her new husband Jason." My mother Patricia was seated at the front table, already pressing a napkin to the corner of her eye so as not to ruin her makeup. Next to her, my father Richard nodded with profound pride, though his gaze was fixed entirely on his son rather than the bride. "Growing up with Sydney was an adventure." Derek continued, pacing slightly across the stone patio. While other girls were out socializing or going to parties, Sydney was locked in her room, hiding behind computer screens. She was always so intense, so high-strung. I remember when she was a teenager, always refusing to participate in our family events. My parents tried so hard to bring her out of her shell. They gave her every opportunity, every advantage, but Sydney always insisted on isolating herself. We spent a lot of time worrying about her, wondering how she would navigate the real world when she was so disconnected from it. A few polite chuckles rippled through the crowd. I felt Jason's jaw clench beside me. He squeezed my hand under the table, instantly recognizing the insult wrapped in brotherly affection. "We had to protect her," Derek said, placing a hand over his heart. "It is what a big brother does. I always told my parents that one day someone would come along who could handle her unique brand of chaos, and then came Jason." He gestured toward my husband with a magnanimous smile. "Jason, you are a brave man for taking on our resident computer nerd. You have a lot of patience and you are going to need it. But seriously, we are thrilled to officially welcome you to the family. You give us hope that Sydney has finally found some stability." The word stability was heavily emphasized. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was planting the seed. He was establishing a narrative for all these wealthy guests, for Jason's corporate law partners, and for our parents' high society friends. He was framing me as fragile, erratic, and unstable. That way, when I collapsed on the dance floor in a drugged stupor, no one would suspect foul play. They would just shake their heads, whisper about my mental health, and validate the exact narrative my family had pushed for years. "So," Derek said, turning his body fully toward me and raising his glass high, "to Sydney and Jason, may your marriage bring you the peace and normalcy you so desperately need." The guests raised their glasses, murmuring their agreements and congratulations. Derek stepped closer to my chair. The scent of his expensive cologne was overpowering as he leaned down. To anyone watching from the tables, it looked like a loving brother going in for a warm embrace. He pressed his cheek against mine and whispered directly into my ear, "Congrats, little sister. My surprise is coming soon." The sheer malice in his voice was chilling. He pulled back, his lips curved into a triumphant smirk, his eyes dancing with cruel anticipation. He held out his glass to me, waiting for the customary clink. I did not break eye contact. I did not let my smile falter for a single fraction of a second. I raised the glass I had just taken from the left side of the table, the safe glass, and tapped it gently against his. Thank you, Derek, I said, my voice steady and bright. I love surprises. His smirk widened, clearly mistaking my composure for naive ignorance. He tipped his head back and took a long, deep swallow of the champagne. I mirrored his action, bringing my own glass to my lips and drinking the crisp, cold liquid. Over the rim of the crystal flute, I watched his throat work as he swallowed the laced alcohol. He drank nearly half the glass in one go. He lowered his glass, looking utterly satisfied with himself. Giving my shoulder a firm, patronizing squeeze, he turned and marched back into the crowd, immediately beelining toward a group of Silicon Valley venture capitalists he had been trying to impress all night. Jason leaned in close to me. "I am so sorry about that speech," he murmured, anger simmering just beneath his calm exterior. He always finds a way to be incredibly insulting while pretending to be nice. "Are you okay?" I turned to look at my husband, the man who had always stood by me, who valued my brilliant mind rather than feeling threatened by it. "I am perfectly fine," I replied, and it was the absolute truth. I glanced down at my wrist. It was exactly 7:15 in the evening. In my line of work, dealing with corporate espionage and physical security protocols, you learn the exact pharmacology of common sabotage agents. The pill I had watched him drop into the glass dissolved rapidly, indicating a fast-acting formulation. Given Derek's goal of creating a highly public, highly embarrassing spectacle, it was likely a potent cocktail. A heavy sedative mixed with a rapid-onset muscle relaxant, or a high-grade gastrointestinal stimulant. Something designed to bypass the digestive system quickly when mixed with alcohol and hit the bloodstream with devastating force. A drug like that does not work instantly. It needs time to metabolize. First comes a slight warmth, a false sense of confidence. Then the cognitive impairment begins, slurring words and loosening inhibitions. Finally, the total loss of motor control. Based on his weight and the amount of alcohol he was consuming, I calculated the timeline. He had 45 to 50 minutes before his nervous system hijacked his body entirely. I looked across the dance floor. Derek was currently shaking hands with the managing director of a major tech fund, laughing loudly, holding his half-empty glass of poisoned champagne. He was at the absolute height of his arrogance, convinced he had just successfully orchestrated my ultimate humiliation. I reached for Jason's hand, feeling the solid grounding weight of his fingers interlocking with mine. The music swelled, the lights twinkled, and the California night air felt absolutely perfect. I smiled and checked my watch one more time. The countdown had officially begun. The first 20 minutes passed in a blur of clinking silverware and the low murmur of polite conversation. Dinner was served, a flawless presentation of roasted quail and truffle risotto. From my seat at the sweetheart table, I kept a peripheral watch on my brother. Derek was holding court near the open bar, a fresh drink in his hand. He was mingling with a group of venture capitalists, aggressively pitching his cryptocurrency hedge fund. I took a slow bite of my dinner, mentally calculating the metabolic rate of the drug he had ingested. Alcohol acts as a potent multiplier for heavy sedatives. By combining the poisoned champagne with whatever whiskey he was currently drinking, Derek was rapidly accelerating his own demise. At the 30-minute mark, the initial phase of the chemical payload breached his system. I saw the exact second the false confidence took over. Derek's posture shifted. He puffed out his chest, waving his arms in wide, exaggerated gestures. His laughter grew uncharacteristically loud, echoing across the stone patio and drawing the attention of nearby tables. My mother, Patricia, glanced over at him with a fond, indulgent smile. In her eyes, Derek could do no wrong. He was simply the life of the party, celebrating his sister's big day. She had no idea she was watching the opening act of a disaster. By minute 40, the cognitive impairment became impossible to ignore. The band had started playing upbeat music and the dance floor was filling up. Derek had managed to corner a prominent Silicon Valley investor near the edge of the red carpet that led into the main ballroom. I watched as Derek swayed on his feet, his center of gravity completely thrown off by the heavy sedative. He leaned in too close to the investor, jabbing a finger into the older man's chest. Even from a distance, I could see the confusion and discomfort on the investor's face. Derek was no longer charming. He was becoming a liability. The drug was stripping away the protective layers of his prefrontal cortex, dismantling his verbal filter. The arrogant, polished facade of the successful hedge fund manager was melting away, exposing the rot underneath. His voice carried over the music, sharp and slurred. I heard snippets of his conversation drifting across the terrace. He was not pitching his business anymore. He was unraveling. He shouted something about margin calls and liquidity. He laughed wildly, swaying dangerously to the left. "You think I have money?" Derek yelled, his voice cracking with a bizarre mixture of panic and drug-induced euphoria. "It is all a house of cards. I am drowning. Every single dime is gone." The venture capitalist took a horrified step back, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Several other guests turned to stare. The music seemed to fade into the background as the reality of Derek's public breakdown took center stage. My father, Richard, finally noticed the commotion. His face darkened with anger, recognizing that his golden child was making a scene in front of incredibly important people. Richard stood up from his table, aggressively pushing his chair back, intending to intercept his son and quiet him down. But Richard was too late. Minute 45 arrived and the second phase of the drug cocktail activated. The high-grade gastrointestinal stimulant hit Derek like a freight train. I watched his face drain of all color, transforming from flushed, drunken red to a sickly, translucent gray. The wild, slurred laughter died in his throat, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He clutched his stomach, bending double as a massive cramp seized his abdominal muscles. He looked wildly toward the main building, his eyes locking onto the illuminated sign for the restrooms. He took one step forward, intending to run, but the heavy sedative had already turned his legs to lead. His knees buckled. He stumbled forward onto the plush red carpet, his arms flailing as he tried to catch his balance. He collided heavily with a cocktail table, sending a tower of champagne glasses crashing to the ground in a spectacular explosion of shattered crystal. The noise silenced the entire reception. The band stopped playing. 200 guests froze their eyes, fixed on the man writhing on the ground. Derek tried to crawl away, his expensive Italian suit soaked in spilled champagne. He gasped for air, his face contorted in agony. And then the ultimate, unavoidable failure occurred. His body completely hijacked by the aggressive laxative and stripped of all muscular control by the sedative, surrendered entirely. The total loss of bodily function was instantaneous and catastrophic. A dark, foul-smelling stain spread rapidly across the fabric of his tailored trousers, seeping directly onto the pristine red carpet. The smell hit the night air, an overwhelming stench that caused the closest guests to gag and stumble backward in absolute horror. Women in designer gowns covered their mouths, their faces pale with shock. Men turned away in disgust. Derek lay in his own filth, sobbing and drooling, his mental state reduced to a primal panic. He was completely helpless, stripped of his dignity, his power, and his golden boy image. The humiliation was absolute, broadcast in high definition to the exact demographic of people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. "Derek!" Patricia shrieked, the sound tearing through the silent night. She dropped her wineglass and rushed toward the red carpet, but stopped abruptly when she saw the extent of the disaster. She covered her nose with her silk shawl, paralyzed by the sheer embarrassment of the situation. Her perfect social standing, her flawless family image was literally soiled on the floor for all of Napa Valley to witness. Richard stood frozen by his table, his fists clenched, his face a mask of mortification. Total chaos erupted. Someone in the crowd yelled for a doctor. A frantic catering manager grabbed a radio, frantically calling for medical assistance. The venue staff rushed forward with towels and privacy screens, trying desperately to block the horrific scene from the guests' view. But it was useless. The damage was done. The memory was burned into the minds of everyone present. Beside me, Jason was on his feet, his phone already in his hand, dialing emergency services. He looked down at me, his eyes wide with shock and concern. I remained seated. I smoothed a stray piece of lace on my wedding dress, picked up my champagne flute, and took a slow, calm sip. Within minutes, the wail of sirens cut through the quiet vineyard. Flashing red and white lights illuminated the oak trees as an ambulance tore up the gravel driveway. Paramedics rushed onto the terrace with a stretcher, pushing through the crowd of disgusted, whispering guests. They loaded my sobbing, incoherent brother onto the gurney, strapping him down as he continued to slur absolute nonsense about his crushing debts and fake crypto funds. I sat in my chair holding my husband's hand, perfectly composed. I watched the paramedics wheel the stretcher away, leaving behind a ruined red carpet and the shattered remnants of my family's pristine reputation. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. The first firewall had been breached, and the system was working exactly as I designed it. The sliding glass doors of the Napa Valley General Hospital emergency room parted with a heavy mechanical hiss. The harsh, clinical fluorescent lights above were a brutal contrast to the soft fairy lights of my ruined wedding reception. I walked through the triage area, still wearing my tailored white gown, the heavy silk trailing slightly across the sterile linoleum floor. I must have looked like a ghost drifting into a nightmare, but my mind was operating with absolute clarity. Jason walked close beside me, his hand resting protectively on the small of my back. He was radiating a quiet, dangerous energy, his corporate lawyer instincts fully engaged after witnessing my family drop their masks and expose their absolute madness. Before we even reached the main reception desk, a shrill voice shattered the quiet of the waiting room. "What did you do to him?" My mother, Patricia, marched toward us like a heat-seeking missile. Her perfectly coiffed hair was beginning to unravel, and her expensive silk shawl was clutched tightly around her shoulders. Her face was contorted with a vicious, unhinged rage that she usually reserved for contractors who crossed her at her precious homeowners association meetings. She did not ask if I was all right. She did not apologize for my wedding being destroyed in the most grotesque manner possible. She stopped inches from my face and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You poisoned him. I know you did. You have always been jealous of your brother." I stared at her, my expression completely blank. I let her words hang in the cold, sanitized air of the hospital. I refused to give her the emotional reaction she was desperately trying to provoke. "Do not look at me with that innocent face," Patricia screamed, her voice echoing down the long corridor and drawing the immediate attention of several triage nurses and a security guard. Just like in college when you put sleeping pills in his coffee so he would fail his finals. You could never stand seeing him succeed while you sat in the dark playing on your computers. The sheer audacity of her delusion was breathtaking yet entirely predictable. I remembered that week in college vividly. It was a foundational piece of the twisted mythology my parents had built around their golden child. Derek had been buckling under the intense pressure of his business degree program. To cope, he had been popping black market stimulants for days to force himself to study, followed by heavy sedatives to force himself to sleep. When his heart rhythm became dangerously erratic, and he ended up in the campus clinic right before his macroeconomics final, he needed a convenient scapegoat to avoid our parents' furious wrath. He pointed his finger directly at his quiet, introverted younger sister. He claimed I spiked his drink to sabotage him because I was envious of his popularity. Patricia and Richard swallowed the lie instantly, without a single shred of evidence. It was far easier for them to brand me a jealous villain than to admit their perfect son was cracking under their suffocating expectations and abusing narcotics. Jason stepped smoothly between my mother and me, utilizing his imposing height to force her to take a physical step back. "Patricia, lower your voice immediately," Jason said. His tone was not a request. It was a firm legal boundary being drawn in concrete. "Derek had a severe medical emergency at our wedding. Sydney has done nothing but show up here out of courtesy to check on his condition. If you cannot speak to my wife with basic human respect, we will turn around and leave right now." Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as if Jason had physically struck her. She was entirely unaccustomed to being spoken to with such authoritative defiance. "How dare you speak to me that way? My son is in a treatment room having his stomach pumped because of that vindictive girl." Before Jason could verbally dismantle her again, heavy, aggressive footsteps approached from the hallway leading to the restricted treatment areas. My father, Richard, emerged from the secure double doors. His face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. During his decades as a ruthless banking executive, Richard had perfected the exact art of intimidation. He used his authority to crush anyone who stood in the path of his family reputation. Tonight, that pristine reputation was lying in a hospital bed covered in its own waste, and Richard desperately needed someone to pay for the damages. He walked straight past Jason, completely ignoring my husband's defensive posture, and locked his dark, piercing eyes onto mine. He did not yell like my mother. He did not need to. His voice was a low, menacing growl that carried far more weight and danger than Patricia's hysterical screaming. "The doctors just gave me the preliminary toxicology report," Richard stated, stepping so close I could smell the stale whiskey on his breath from the reception. "They found extremely high concentrations of a fast-acting sedative and a commercial-grade laxative in his system." I held his gaze, my breathing even and steady. I was mentally preparing for the exact sequence of events I knew was coming next. "He was perfectly fine before he went to your table to propose a toast," Richard continued, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You handed him a drink, Sydney. I saw you tap your glass against his. I am not going to stand here and ask you for a confession. I am going to call the police right now and have you arrested for the deliberate poisoning of my son." The threat hung heavily between us, dripping with malicious intent. My father stood tall, fully expecting me to crumble into a panic, to beg for forgiveness, to revert back to the terrified young girl who used to cower under his domineering shadow. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone, his thumb hovering over the keypad, ready to dial emergency services and ruin my life. "Go ahead and make the call, Richard," I said, my voice eerily calm against the frantic energy of the emergency room. "Dial the number. Or better yet, save yourself the trouble." I nodded toward a uniformed Napa County Sheriff's deputy who was already marching down the corridor, drawn by my mother's hysterical screaming. The deputy placed a hand on his utility belt, looking between Jason's defensive posture and my father's aggressive stance. "Is there a problem here?" the deputy asked, his eyes scanning the four of us. "This is a hospital, folks. You need to keep the volume down, or I will have you all escorted off the premises." My father immediately seized the opportunity. He puffed out his chest, stepping toward the deputy with the entitled authority of a man who believed he owned the world. "Officer, I need to report a crime. My son was just admitted to this emergency room in critical condition. He was poisoned at a wedding reception tonight, and the woman who did it is standing right in front of you. I want her arrested immediately." The deputy frowned, pulling a small notepad from his breast pocket. He looked at me, taking in my heavy white wedding gown and my perfectly serene expression. "You are accusing the bride of poisoning a guest?" he asked, his tone laced with heavy skepticism. "Not a guest," Patricia shrieked from behind my father. "Her own brother. She is a vindictive, jealous sociopath. She spiked his drink. The doctors just confirmed he ingested a massive dose of sedatives and laxatives. Arrest her." The deputy held up a hand to silence my mother, then turned his attention back to me. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say about these allegations?" I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or scramble to defend my character. I simply turned to Jason. My husband reached into the leather messenger bag he had grabbed from the bridal suite before we followed the ambulance. He pulled out my secure encrypted iPad and placed it firmly in my hands. In the cybersecurity industry, paranoia is not a flaw, it is a fundamental job requirement. When you spend your life analyzing threat vectors, you learn never to trust an unverified environment. The moment I booked the sprawling vineyard estate for my wedding, I legally mandated full access to their internal network architecture as part of the venue contract. I had seamlessly mirrored their high-definition security camera feeds directly to my personal device as a standard precaution. When your guest list includes a brother who has spent his entire life trying to sabotage you, leaving blind spots is simply not an option. I unlocked the tablet using my biometric scan and opened the encrypted video file I had clipped just before leaving the venue. "I am a cybersecurity consultant, officer," I said, my tone remaining entirely conversational. "My professional expertise involves gathering digital forensics to expose malicious activity. I do not deal in baseless accusations. I deal in hard data. I highly suggest you watch this before you write a single word in that notepad. I handed the glowing iPad to the deputy. The screen displayed a razor-sharp 4K resolution feed from the camera mounted directly above the venue's main bar. My parents leaned in, their faces tight with confident anticipation. They truly believed I was cornered. They expected the footage to somehow validate their twisted delusions. Instead, they watched their golden child orchestrate his own demise. The video played in absolute silence. The high-definition lens captured Derek approaching the bartender and taking 2 tall flutes of champagne. It showed him stepping behind the towering floral arrangement, thinking he was entirely hidden from the crowd. But the overhead dome camera had a perfect top-down view of his actions. "Look closely at his right hand," I instructed the deputy, pointing at the screen. The deputy watched as Derek reached into his tailored suit jacket. The camera caught the distinct, undeniable motion of Derek dropping a small white tablet into the glass on the left. The tablet fizzed rapidly and dissolved into the champagne. My mother let out a sharp gasp, the sound catching in her throat as she watched her perfect son commit a calculated, premeditated crime. My father stared at the screen, his jaw locked so tightly the muscles visibly twitched. I tapped the screen, fast-forwarding the footage by 2 minutes to a different camera angle focused on the sweetheart table. Here is my brother returning to the table. I continued narrating the evidence with cold precision. You will notice he places the tainted glass on the left directly in front of my chair. The untainted glass is on the right. Now watch what happens when he turns his back to greet an investor. The deputy watched the screen intently. He saw my hand shoot out with flawless speed, swapping the glass on the left for the glass on the right. He saw Derek turn back around, pick up the poisoned glass, smile at me, and swallow the laced champagne. The video ended. The screen faded to black. The deputy handed the iPad back to me, his expression entirely transformed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a hard professional glare directed straight at my father. "Sir," the deputy said, his voice dropping an octave, "based on the video evidence I just watched, your daughter did not poison anyone. She simply allowed your son to drink the beverage he deliberately tampered with." In the state of California, slipping an intoxicating or debilitating substance into someone else's drink is a felony. If anyone is leaving this hospital in handcuffs tonight, it is going to be your son the moment he is medically cleared. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the hospital corridor. I watched the cognitive dissonance violently crash over my parents. The irrefutable digital proof of Derek's malicious intent was staring them right in the face. Any normal parent would be horrified. Any rational human being would apologize to me for the false accusations and condemn the brother for attempting to drug the bride at her own wedding. But my parents were not rational. Their entire identities were built on the foundation of Derek's perfection and my inherent inferiority. The pivot happened with terrifying speed. "He was just playing a prank," Patricia suddenly shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the hospital walls. "It was a joke, a sibling prank. He knew you were too uptight today and just wanted to loosen you up. A prank." Jason repeated, his lawyer instincts flaring as he stepped forward. He tried to drug his sister with heavy sedatives and laxatives in front of hundreds of people. "That is not a prank, Patricia. That is a targeted assault." Richard stepped in front of his wife, his dark eyes locked onto mine with a sudden manic intensity. He completely ignored the reality of Derek's crime and latched onto the only thing he could use to attack me. "You hacked the security cameras at your own wedding," Richard hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the iPad in my hands. "What kind of deranged paranoid psychopath does that? You deliberately set up surveillance on your own family. You sat there, watched your brother make a minor mistake, and you maliciously let him hurt himself." "You are sick, Sydney," my mother chimed in, tears of rage finally spilling down her cheeks. "You have always been deeply disturbed. No normal person spies on their family like this. You need severe psychiatric help." I stood perfectly still, watching them unleash an insane double standard to protect their golden child. Derek attempting to drug me was just a minor prank, but me securing video evidence of his felony was the real crime. They were twisting reality, weaponizing my professional expertise against me to paint me as the villain. I could see the exact moment the realization clicked behind my father's eyes. The sinister shift in his posture signaled that he was no longer just trying to defend his son. He had found the exact angle he needed to execute a far more devastating plan. Richard took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The frantic defensive energy he had displayed just moments ago vanished entirely. In its place was the calculating, ruthless demeanor of a banking executive preparing to execute a hostile takeover of a vulnerable company. He did not care that a law enforcement officer was standing right next to us. In Richard's world, wealth and influence dictated reality, and he was about to rewrite the narrative to suit his agenda. "You think you have won something here today?" Richard said, his voice dropping to a theatrical, mournful pitch, perfectly calibrated for the triage nurses and hospital staff to overhear. "But all you have done is prove exactly how sick you really are." He pointed a steady finger at the tablet secured in my hands. He was just pulling a harmless prank. Brothers play jokes at weddings. It is what normal families do. But the real crime here, the real sickness, that is you. That is you hacking into a private security network on your wedding day. You spent the happiest day of your life obsessively spying on your own blood. You are deeply paranoid, Sydney. This just proves you are completely mentally unfit to function in society. Jason stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous warning. "Do not speak to my wife like that, Richard. The deputy has the video. Slipping a heavy narcotic into a bride's drink is a felony, not a prank." The deputy nodded, taking out a digital storage drive from his vest. "I will need a copy of that video file sent to my precinct, ma'am. We will be speaking with your brother as soon as he is medically cleared, and we will be moving forward with an investigation." Richard did not even flinch at the mention of a criminal investigation. His eyes remained locked on mine, gleaming with a predatory triumph. He was already maneuvering 3 steps ahead of the police, pivoting away from Derek's crime and launching directly into a highly orchestrated financial assassination. "Your grandfather was a brilliant traditional man," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. "He wanted to ensure the wealth he built was protected from reckless, erratic behavior. That is why he trusted me to oversee the execution of his estate." I felt a sudden, sharp chill beneath the heavy silk of my wedding dress. My grandfather had left me a massive trust fund worth $15 million. The stipulations of the document were incredibly specific. The funds were scheduled to be fully released to me upon my 35th birthday, or immediately upon the date of my legal marriage. Today was my wedding day. By all legal rights, that $15 million was scheduled to transfer into my private accounts by Monday morning, but I knew exactly which legal loophole my father was about to weaponize against me. The Morality and Mental Stability Clause. Richard stated, confirming my exact suspicion. "It gives me as the sole executor full legal authority to withhold and redirect your inheritance if you demonstrate severe psychological instability or engage in morally reprehensible behavior." Patricia gasped loudly, suddenly, understanding her husband's brilliant, twisted strategy. "She is delusional, Richard. We have all seen it tonight." She stood there and watched her own brother collapse in agony, and she did not lift a single finger to help him. She smiled while he suffered. "She needs a severe psychiatric evaluation immediately." Richard nodded solemnly, playing the role of the tragically burdened patriarch to absolute perfection. "As the executor, I have a fiduciary duty to protect those assets from a woman experiencing a severe psychological break. A woman who illegally spies on her guests and exhibits textbook paranoia cannot be trusted with $15 million. I will be contacting the estate lawyers first thing Monday morning. I am invoking the clause Sydney. I am filing for an emergency conservatorship." The gravity of his threat hung heavily in the sterile hospital air. Jason stiffened beside me. As a corporate lawyer, my husband knew exactly what an emergency conservatorship entailed. It meant stripping me of my basic human and legal rights. It meant freezing my personal bank accounts, seizing my business assets, and treating me like an incompetent child under the eyes of the law. But the most sickening part of the clause was the contingency plan. If I was deemed mentally unfit to manage the $15 million, the full control of that trust fund would automatically default to my next of kin. It would default entirely to Derek. It all made perfect, horrifying sense. Derek attempting to drug me and trigger a public collapse on the dance floor was never just about petty sibling rivalry or ruining my wedding reception. It was a highly calculated financial hit job. They needed me to look crazy in front of hundreds of wealthy witnesses. They needed me hospitalized or institutionalized tonight, so they could immediately trigger the stability clause and steal my inheritance. The fact that Derek had accidentally poisoned himself and ruined his own reputation was just a minor logistical setback in their grand malicious design. "You will not see a single cent of that money." Richard vowed, his voice a cold, hard whisper, meant only for me and Jason. "I will freeze you out completely. By the time my legal team is done with you, you will not even be able to afford a cup of coffee, let alone fund a defense against a conservatorship. You will be locked in a psychiatric ward, and your brother will manage your estate just as your grandfather would have wanted." I did not scream. I did not cry panic or beg my father to reconsider. Showing any emotional distress right now would only feed his manufactured narrative that I was unstable. I simply locked the screen of my iPad, slipped it safely back into Jason's leather messenger bag, and looked my father dead in the eyes. I let the silence stretch, giving him absolutely nothing to use against me. "Let us go." "Jason," I said. My voice was perfectly steady, echoing off the linoleum floors with absolute unwavering control. I turned my back on my parents. Jason wrapped his arm firmly around my waist, glaring at Richard one last time before falling into step beside me. We walked away down the long, brightly lit hospital corridor. Behind us, I could hear Patricia comforting Richard, already spinning their web of lies and playing the victims for the surrounding hospital staff. I did not look back. My father truly believed he had just backed me into a corner and stripped me of my power. He thought he could use his banking connections and the legal system to cage me and steal my future. But as I walked out the sliding glass doors and into the cool California night, my mind was already writing the digital code to dismantle his entire existence. Richard had not just threatened my finances, he had declared absolute war, and he had absolutely no idea how ruthlessly I was prepared to fight. The pristine beaches of our secluded honeymoon in Fiji felt like a distant illusion the moment Jason and I stepped through the front door of our San Francisco home. We had spent the last 7 days entirely off the grid. It was a deliberate choice to unplug, to let the chaos of the wedding reception fade into the background, and to focus entirely on each other. We had left our secure work phones locked in a safe and vowed not to engage with my family. I had assumed Richard was simply throwing empty threats in the hospital hallway. I underestimated his profound capacity for vindictive cruelty. It was a Tuesday evening when we dropped our luggage in the foyer. The house was quiet and perfectly still. I kissed Jason, grabbed a fresh cup of coffee, and walked straight into my home office. It was payroll week for my cybersecurity firm. I employ 12 highly specialized engineers, and compensating them on time is the absolute foundation of my business integrity. I booted up my encrypted workstation and logged into my primary corporate banking portal. A harsh red banner immediately flashed across the screen. "Access denied. Account suspended pending internal compliance review." My brow furrowed. I typed in my credentials a second time, utilizing my secondary authentication token. The same red banner glared back at me. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I quickly opened a new tab and navigated to my personal checking account. Frozen. I checked the joint savings account Jason and I had set up just weeks before the wedding. Frozen. Every single digital vault containing my liquid assets had been slammed shut and padlocked. I called Jason into the office. My husband took one look at the glowing red screens and immediately pulled out his phone, dialing the elite priority line for our bank. As a corporate lawyer, Jason knew exactly how to bypass automated systems and get a human being on the line. But after 10 minutes of intense, rapid-fire questioning, I watched the color drain from Jason's face. He put the phone on speaker and set it on my desk. "I am incredibly sorry, Mr. Evans," the manager said carefully. But the freeze on your wife's accounts did not originate from an automated fraud trigger. It was a manual override initiated directly by our Executive Risk Management Division. Her accounts have been flagged for severe mental health monitoring and erratic financial behavior. We are legally bound to hold the funds until the pending court order is resolved. Before Jason could demand an explanation, my private cell phone began to vibrate on the desk. The caller ID displayed a blocked number, but I did not need a trace to know exactly who was on the other end. I pressed accept and put the call on speaker. "Welcome home, Sydney," my father said. His voice was smooth, relaxed, and dripping with venomous satisfaction. "I hope you enjoyed your little island getaway. I imagine it will be your last vacation for a very long time." "You illegally locked my corporate accounts, Richard," I said, maintaining a flat, emotionless tone. "You are interfering with interstate commerce and withholding payroll for a dozen federal contractors. You are going to trigger a federal investigation." Richard laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the speaker. "Do not try to threaten me with federal investigations, little girl. I sat on the board of directors for that bank for 15 years. I play golf with the current CEO every other Sunday. All it took was one phone call expressing deep paternal concern for a daughter who recently suffered a severe psychological break. I simply provided them with the police report from your wedding night highlighting the fact that you allowed your own brother to be poisoned. The bank was more than happy to protect your assets from your own unstable decisions. You cannot freeze my accounts permanently without a judge's order," Jason interjected, his legal mind immediately searching for the procedural flaw. "That is exactly right, Jason," my father replied smugly, "which is why my legal team filed the emergency conservatorship petition this morning while you two were busy flying over the Pacific. We bypassed the standard waiting period. A judge has already signed the preliminary injunction. You are completely paralyzed, Sydney." The sheer scale of his malice was breathtaking. He had weaponized his old banking connections to choke off my financial air supply. He knew my $15 million trust fund was set to clear this week, and he had built a bureaucratic fortress around it. "You cannot pay your employees tomorrow morning," Richard continued, twisting the knife. "You cannot hire a defense attorney. You cannot even buy groceries right now without begging your husband for his credit card. I told you I would freeze you out, and I am a man of my word. Sign the conservatorship papers, Sydney. Surrender your grandfather's trust to Derek, and I will make this all go away. If you fight me, your company will collapse by Friday when your engineers walk out." The line went dead. The silence in the office was deafening. Jason paced the floor, running his hands through his hair as he mentally calculated injunction appeals and emergency court filings. I stared at the blank monitor. The weight of Richard's trap was suffocating. My cybersecurity firm was my life's work. I had built it from scratch, and my team relied on me to feed their families. If I defaulted on payroll, my reputation in the tech industry would be obliterated instantly. I was trapped in a financial stranglehold, outgunned by an old money billionaire who knew exactly how to manipulate the legal system. Hours ticked by. Midnight passed, turning the dark California sky into a deep, oppressive black. Jason and I sat at the kitchen island surrounded by legal pads and open laptops. I was furiously typing, attempting to legally route emergency funds through a secondary offshore server I kept for absolute emergencies. But Richard's freeze was too comprehensive. He had targeted my social security number, blocking every domestic financial avenue available to me. The panic was slowly creeping up the back of my throat. I had 72 hours to find a legal loophole before my business went under. The digital clock on the microwave flipped to 2 a.m. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive pounding echoed through the quiet house. Jason and I froze. The pounding came again, harder this time, frantic and desperate, against the heavy oak of our front door. Someone was trying to break the door down. Jason instantly stood up, quietly reaching for the heavy metal flashlight we kept near the entryway. I did not move toward the door. Instead, I swiped my finger across my tablet, pulling up the high-definition night vision feed from my front porch security camera. I braced myself to see my father, or maybe the police arriving to serve me with the official conservatorship papers. But the person standing under the porch light, shivering in the cold night air and repeatedly slamming their fist against the wood, was the absolute last person on earth I ever expected to see. It was my sister-in-law. It was Derek's wife. I tapped the intercom button on my desk, my voice cautious in the dead of the night. "Monique, what are you doing here?" "Let me in, Sydney!" Her voice cracked through the small speaker, sharp and trembling with suppressed rage. "I am not wearing a wire, and I am not here on their behalf. Open the door before your father's private security realizes I slipped my tail." I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. Jason stood right behind me, his grip on the metal flashlight loosening, but his stance remaining entirely defensive. Monique practically fell inside. She was 34 years old, a brilliant African-American forensic accountant who had spent the last 5 years enduring my mother's thinly veiled microaggressions and my father's condescending remarks. Tonight, however, the polished, accommodating daughter-in-law was completely gone. She was wearing a dark trench coat over loose sweatpants, her hair pulled into a messy knot, but it was what she was carrying that caught my attention. In her arms was a massive, overflowing cardboard banker's box, heavy enough that her knuckles had turned pale. She marched straight past Jason and me, heading directly for the kitchen island, where my laptops were still glowing red with lockout screens. She dropped the heavy box onto the marble countertop with a deafening thud that rattled my coffee mug. Without waiting for an invitation, she began pulling out thick manila folders, ledgers, and external hard drives, spreading them aggressively across the kitchen island. Monique Jason started stepping forward. "What is going on? Did Richard send you?" Monique whipped around, her eyes blazing with a fierce, untamed anger. "Richard does not know I am here. Derek is currently passed out in our guest bedroom, heavily medicated and whining about how his entire life is ruined." I waited until the house was dead silent, bypassed our own security system, and packed up my home office. She leaned her hands flat against the marble, looking directly at me. "I am filing for divorce, Sydney. I am taking my children and I am leaving your racist scam artist family for good." I have smiled through Patricia's backhanded compliments. I have ignored Richard treating me like a diversity hire at family dinners. I did it because I thought Derek actually loved me and was trying to build a separate life for us. But after what I saw him do to you at your wedding and watching your parents immediately try to destroy you to protect him, I am entirely done playing nice. I stood frozen, processing the sheer magnitude of her defection. Monique had always been the quiet observer at family gatherings. I remembered how Patricia had assigned Monique to a table near the kitchen at our wedding reception, claiming it was a seating chart glitch. I remembered Richard introducing Monique to his banking friends simply as Derek's wife, completely erasing her prestigious career as a partner at a top-tier accounting firm. They thought she was just a quiet, compliant accessory to their golden boy. They had no idea they had welcomed a financial apex predator into their inner circle. "They froze my accounts," I told her, my voice low. "Richard invoked the morality clause. He triggered an emergency conservatorship. I cannot make payroll for my cybersecurity firm tomorrow morning. 12 engineers are going to wake up without their paychecks." Monique did not look surprised. She nodded slowly, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "Of course he did. I heard him on the phone with the estate lawyers yesterday morning. He was bragging to Patricia about how he choked off your financial supply. They think they have you completely trapped. They think you are going to surrender the $15 million trust fund by the end of the week." Jason crossed his arms, his lawyer persona fully engaging. "We have 72 hours to file a counter-injunction, but with Sydney's assets frozen, we cannot retain the necessary litigation team to fight Richard's firm in San Francisco. He has effectively cornered us." "He thinks he cornered you," Monique corrected, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous, calculating light. "Your father relies on brute force and intimidation. He uses his wealth as a hammer. But he fundamentally misunderstands the digital age, and he severely underestimated his own daughter-in-law." She reached into the pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a small encrypted titanium flash drive. She held it up between her fingers. "When Derek came home from the hospital, he was a wreck," Monique explained, pacing the length of the kitchen island. "He was terrified, crying about how his investors were going to ruin him. I thought he was just having a panic attack from the drugs he accidentally ingested, but then I noticed he was frantically trying to wipe his secure servers from his home office laptop. He was sloppy. He left his primary vault unlocked while he went to the bathroom to throw up. Monique stopped pacing and turned to face me. I am a forensic accountant, Sydney. I track missing money for the federal government. It took me exactly 20 minutes of digging through his decrypted folders to realize that your brother is not a successful hedge fund manager. He is a desperate, cornered animal. I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere of the room. The oppressive panic that had been suffocating me for the last 4 hours began to lift, replaced by the sharp electric thrill of an impending counterattack. "What did you find?" Jason asked, stepping closer to the island, his eyes locked on the flash drive. Monique looked at me, handing over the titanium drive. "I am going to burn my marriage to the ground, Sydney. I am going to make sure Derek never sees the outside of a federal penitentiary, and I am going to make sure Richard and Patricia lose every ounce of their precious social standing. But I cannot do it alone. I have the financial ledgers, but I need a cybersecurity expert to trace the offshore routing numbers and bypass his remaining firewalls before he realizes the data is missing." I took the flash drive from her hand. The cold metal felt like a loaded weapon. My family had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable asset and treating Monique like a secondary citizen. Now the two women they had underestimated the most were standing in a kitchen at 2 in the morning, holding the keys to their absolute destruction. Monique gestured toward my glowing laptop screen, her expression hardening into absolute resolve. "Plug it in, Sydney. You need to see what your brother actually does for a living." I slid the titanium flash drive into the secure port of my air-gapped laptop. I never connected external hardware to my primary network without running it through a quarantined digital sandbox first. A green progress bar flashed across the screen as my decryption software chewed through the protective layers of Derek's files. The bar reached 100%, and a massive directory of spreadsheets, wire transfer receipts, and offshore bank routing numbers populated my monitor. Monique stepped up beside me, her finger tracing the digital columns. "Look at the inflow from the first quarter of last year," she instructed, her voice dropping into a clinical professional register. Derek launched Apex Digital Assets with a massive aggressive marketing campaign. He promised his clients a guaranteed 12% return on crypto staking. But if you look at the actual blockchain ledger records I pulled from his hidden server, you will see the truth. There is no staking protocol. There is no trading algorithm. I brought up the transaction histories, my eyes scanning the hexadecimal hashes. I quickly traced the wallet addresses using a blockchain visualization tool. The money was not going into decentralized finance protocols or legitimate investment vehicles. It was being routed through a complex web of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, then funneled right back to the original investors to simulate fabricated profits. "It is a Ponzi scheme," Jason said softly, standing directly behind my chair. "A classic textbook Ponzi scheme built on a blockchain to sound innovative." "Exactly," Monique confirmed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "He used the complexity of cryptocurrency to blind his wealthy investors. He paid his early adopters with funds stolen from new victims. But 6 months ago, the crypto market experienced a massive, unprecedented crash. The influx of new capital dried up instantly. Derek panicked. He tried to cover the massive gap by making incredibly reckless, highly leveraged trades on unregulated offshore exchanges. He honestly thought he could win the money back in a single lucky swing. Instead, he got completely liquidated. I highlighted a specific cell at the bottom of the master spreadsheet. The final tally glowed in a stark, unforgiving red font. "He is down $8 million, I stated, the terrifying reality of the numbers sinking into the quiet room. "He has an $8 million deficit in client funds." "It gets significantly worse," Monique warned, sliding a printed document from her heavy banker's box across my keyboard. "Look at the recent client list. These are not naive tech bros or bored dentists from Patricia's country club. Derek got desperate for a capital injection 3 months ago when the walls started closing in. He started taking money from unverified, unregulated private equity firms operating out of Eastern Europe. I cross-referenced the corporate entities on my secure server. My blood ran completely cold. The shell companies funding Derek's final desperate gamble were heavily linked to sanctioned Russian oligarchs and international money laundering syndicates. These were not the type of people who filed civil lawsuits when their investments disappeared. These were people who hired professionals to break your kneecaps, threaten your family, or ensure you vanished entirely into the Pacific Ocean. The puzzle pieces violently snapped into place. The sheer terrifying clarity of the situation hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the marble island. The wedding, I whispered, my voice tight with realization. The poisoned champagne on the sweetheart table. It was never just about embarrassing me in front of Jason's corporate partners. It was never just petty sibling rivalry. He needed your trust fund, Jason realized aloud, his sharp legal mind connecting the financial motive directly to the criminal action. He owes $8 million to men who will literally kill him. Your grandfather's trust fund is worth $15 million. Derek was completely out of options. He was facing a violent, brutal end, and you were sitting on a massive, inaccessible pile of cash. But the money was locked behind my 35th birthday, or my marriage. I continued tracing the twisted timeline aloud. He could not touch a single cent of it. Unless I was deemed psychologically unfit. If I suffered a catastrophic, highly public mental breakdown at my own wedding reception, Richard could instantly invoke the morality and stability clause. Richard would take immediate legal control of the estate as the executor, and the funds would default to the next of kin to manage. To Derek, Monique finished, her eyes dark with disgust. Richard would simply hand Derek the $15 million to pay off the Russian syndicates. He would sacrifice you to save his golden boy from a shallow grave and protect the precious family reputation from a massive, highly publicized federal fraud scandal. You were the sacrificial lamb, Sydney. They were fully willing to lock you in a psychiatric ward and steal your rightful inheritance just to cover Derek's criminal incompetence. The staggering betrayal was absolute. My own father had happily conspired to strip away my basic human rights, drug me, and label me legally insane, all to protect a son who was actively running a criminal enterprise. Richard did not freeze my corporate accounts out of spite. He froze them to paralyze me, ensuring I had absolutely no financial resources to fight the conservatorship before the Russian mob came collecting on Derek's massive debt. "We have the evidence to destroy him right now," Jason said, staring at the glowing screen. "We hand these ledgers over to the FBI and the SEC tomorrow morning. Derek goes to federal prison for decades." "No," Monique interrupted sharply, slamming her hand flat against the counter. "If we just hand this over to the federal authorities, the asset seizure process takes months, maybe even years. The Russian creditors will realize the money is gone, and the feds have the ledgers. They will not wait for the slow wheels of the American justice system. They will come after Derek, and they will likely come after anyone connected to his name, including me and my innocent children. We need a tactical strike, not a bureaucratic one." I looked at the thick stack of legal documents Jason had spread across the kitchen island earlier that night. Jason went exactly as the conservatorship hearing. Jason pulled the preliminary injunction filing from the pile, scanning the dense legal text. Richard is moving with terrifying speed. He did not file for a standard court hearing. He filed an ex parte emergency motion, citing an immediate critical risk of severe self-harm based on the hospital report. Because he used his old banking influence to secure a highly favorable, sympathetic judge, the final hearing to strip you of your legal autonomy is scheduled for Friday morning. I glanced at the digital clock on my kitchen wall. It was nearly 3 a.m. on Wednesday. "We have exactly 48 hours, I said, my voice hardening into absolute, unwavering resolve. "Richard thinks he has successfully cut off my air supply. Derek thinks he is mere days away from a $15 million payday to save his own life. They are moving aggressively to accelerate the conservatorship so they can pay off violent criminals by Friday afternoon." I turned back to my air-gapped laptop, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. The initial shock of the betrayal was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating mindset of a cybersecurity architect preparing for an all-out digital war. "They want to play a high-stakes financial game," I announced to Jason and Monique, pulling up an encrypted terminal window. "Fine. We are going to dismantle their entire operation from the inside out, and we are going to do it before the courthouse doors even open on Friday. The kitchen transformed into a war room in a matter of minutes. I dragged two high-powered monitors from my office, setting them up next to the marble island, while Jason brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Monique arranged her ledgers into precise overlapping columns, her forensic mind already dissecting the chaotic financial mess my brother had left behind. I worked in a synchronized high-stakes rhythm. The clock was aggressively ticking toward Friday morning. We needed irrefutable proof cleanly acquired and legally admissible to stop my father from sealing the conservatorship trap. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Derek thought he was a tech-savvy genius because he managed a cryptocurrency fund, but his digital security was a joke. He used standard commercial-grade encryption with factory default firewall settings. For a seasoned cybersecurity architect, breaching his hidden server was like walking through a screen door. I deployed a specialized packet-sniffing script I had written for penetrating hostile corporate networks. Within 14 minutes, I bypassed his two-factor authentication and gained root access to his entire digital life. I have the master directory I announced watching the data populate across my left monitor. I am pulling his encrypted email archive's secure messaging logs and deleted transaction histories. Monique did not look up from her spreadsheets. She was a machine cross-referencing the offshore routing numbers I fed her against global banking databases. "Give me the Cyprus accounts first," she demanded, her pen flying across a yellow legal pad. Derek tried to obscure the Russian money by layering it through 3 different shell companies in Nicosia, but he was lazy. He used the same registered agent for all of them. I can prove the initial $8 million injection came directly from a sanctioned entity, and I can prove he lost every single penny of it in a catastrophic short position just 4 weeks ago. I ran a batch download on his messaging history, isolating communications from the past 90 days. I set a search query for specific keywords: trust fund, conservatorship, hospital, Sydney, the progress bar completed. A massive thread of highly confidential emails populated my screen. They were sent between Derek, my father Richard, and my mother Patricia. My breath caught in my throat. I had expected to find evidence of Derek begging our parents for a financial bailout. I had expected to find Richard scheming to protect his son from the authorities. What I found was infinitely more sinister. Jason walked up behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder as we read the email chain together. It was a meticulously documented conspiracy. 3 weeks before my wedding, Derek had confessed the total loss of the $8 million to our parents. Instead of turning him in or forcing him to face the consequences, Richard immediately pivoted to my grandfather's trust fund. The emails outlined the exact legal threshold required to trigger the morality and stability clause. My own father had written the tactical blueprint for my destruction. I clicked on a message sent by Patricia just 4 days before the ceremony. My stomach violently turned as I read the words my mother had typed. "Make sure the dosage is strong enough to cause a complete loss of motor function," Patricia wrote to Derek. Richard spoke to a judge at the club. "A simple fainting spell will not be enough to secure an emergency ex parte order. She needs to look entirely unhinged. She needs to lose control of her bodily functions in front of the partners. I will make sure the photographer is positioned to catch the collapse." They knew. They had planned the poisoning down to the exact milligram. My mother was not just a passive bystander protecting her golden child. She was an active conspirator who had weaponized my wedding day to secure a payday for a criminal. She wanted me humiliated. She wanted me stripped of my dignity so thoroughly that no judge would ever question her husband's demand to lock me away in a psychiatric ward. "They are monsters," Monique whispered, reading the screen over my shoulder. Her voice shook with a mixture of horror and vindication. "I knew they were terrible people, but this is premeditated assault. They plan to poison you, steal your inheritance, and feed it directly to an international money laundering syndicate." I felt a bizarre, icy detachment settle over me. The last remaining threads of familial obligation evaporated into the cold night air. They were no longer my parents. They were hostile threat actors, and I was going to systematically dismantle their entire infrastructure. "I am packaging all of this," I said, my fingers flying across the keys as I initiated a secure backup protocol. We have the financial fraud, the extortion motive, and the premeditated assault. Once Jason formats this into a federal dossier, we can bypass the local police entirely and hand Richard and Derek over to the FBI. Jason did not respond. I turned around in my chair. Jason was standing near the hallway, his cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. His face had gone completely pale, the color draining from his cheeks in a matter of seconds. As a corporate lawyer who thrived in high-stakes litigation, Jason rarely showed panic. But right now his eyes were wide with a profound, terrifying disbelief. He lowered the phone slowly, staring at the blank screen. "Jason," I asked, standing up from my workstation, "what is wrong? Who was on the phone at this hour?" "It was the managing partner at my law firm," Jason said. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual confidence. "What happened?" Monique asked, stepping away from her financial ledgers. "They just suspended me," Jason replied, looking directly at me. His hands were actually trembling. "The firm received a massive, highly detailed ethical complaint an hour ago. Someone handed over a heavily doctored digital trail accusing me of embezzling client funds and violating attorney-client privilege. The partners are locking me out of the building. They are initiating disbarment proceedings by the end of the week." The air in the kitchen vanished. Richard was not just playing defense. He had realized Jason was my only legal shield, and he had launched a devastating preemptive strike against my husband's career. They were burning our lives to the ground, and the 48-hour timer had just accelerated. The silence that followed Jason's words was thick and suffocating. I stared at my husband, watching him try to process the total destruction of his professional life. Jason had spent the last decade building an impeccable reputation as a corporate litigator. He worked grueling 80-hour weeks, navigated complex mergers, and earned his place at one of the most prestigious law firms in San Francisco through sheer intellect and unbreakable integrity. Now, with a single orchestrated phone call, my father had incinerated it all. "Who filed the complaint?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I needed data. I needed the exact threat vector Richard had used to penetrate our defenses. Jason took a deep, shuddering breath and placed his phone face down on the marble counter. "Bradley," he said, his tone laced with disbelief. "He was a senior paralegal I fired 6 months ago for gross negligence and chronic absenteeism. He held a massive grudge against me, but he vanished after his termination. The managing partner just told me that Bradley submitted a heavily documented whistleblower report directly to the State Bar Association and the firm's ethics committee. He provided sworn affidavits, fabricated email chains, and a doctored digital trail showing I supposedly siphoned client escrow funds into offshore accounts." Monique leaned over the kitchen island, her forensic accountant instincts flaring. "Offshore accounts," she repeated. "Let me guess. The routing numbers in this fabricated report conveniently mirror the same type of Cyprus shell companies Derek uses for his crypto scam." Jason nodded grimly. "The managing partner said the financial documentation looks incredibly sophisticated. It is not just a disgruntled employee sending a basic complaint. Someone manufactured a flawless, high-level paper trail designed to survive a preliminary audit. The firm had no choice but to lock me out of the corporate network immediately to limit their own liability. They are obligated to report the allegations to federal regulators by the end of the week." I felt a white-hot rage ignite in the center of my chest. Richard and Derek were not just fighting dirty, they were waging a scorched-earth campaign. They knew Jason was my anchor. They knew his legal expertise was the only thing keeping Richard's emergency conservatorship filing from steamrolling right over me. By neutralizing Jason, they stripped me of my legal counsel and completely isolated me. "My father is funding this," I stated, pacing the length of the kitchen. "Richard has the banking connections to forge the wire transfer receipts. Derek has the offshore shell companies to create the fake routing trails. They found a disgruntled former employee, handed him a massive bribe, and gave him the exact script needed to destroy you. They are hitting us where it hurts the most." Jason leaned his weight against the counter, rubbing his eyes. "If the State Bar moves forward with an official investigation based on fabricated federal wire fraud, I am not just looking at a suspension. I am looking at permanent disbarment. I could face criminal charges. My entire career is gone, Sydney, Everything I built is just gone. Seeing the absolute devastation in my husband's eyes shattered my heart, but it also solidified my resolve into pure steel. They had crossed an unforgivable line. Attacking me was one thing. I was used to being their punching bag, but attacking the man who loved me, the man who had stood by me when my own blood tried to destroy my sanity, was a fatal mistake. Before I could outline our next move, my personal cell phone buzzed against the marble countertop. The screen lit up with a notification. It was a new voicemail from a blocked number. I did not need to guess who had bypassed my call-blocking protocols. Richard always demanded the last word in any negotiation. I tapped the screen and pressed the speaker icon, letting the audio fill the tense air of the kitchen. "Hello, Sydney," my father's voice echoed through the room. His tone was perfectly measured, completely devoid of anger, sounding exactly like a CEO closing a brutal corporate acquisition. "I trust you and Jason have had an eventful evening. I understand his firm received some very concerning news tonight. It is truly tragic how quickly a promising legal career can disintegrate when ethical boundaries are crossed." I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. Jason stood perfectly still, listening to the man who had just orchestrated his professional execution. "The legal world is incredibly unforgiving," Richard continued smoothly. "An embezzlement investigation of that magnitude will trigger federal indictments. Jason will be disbarred. He will likely face federal prison time. And with your corporate accounts currently frozen, pending your mental health evaluation, neither of you will have the financial resources to mount an adequate criminal defense. You are entirely out of options, my dear. You have absolutely nowhere left to run." Monique scoffed quietly in disgust, crossing her arms as she listened to the blatant extortion. "But I am not an unreasonable man," Richard's voice purred from the speaker. "I am your father, and I simply want what is best for this family." The whistleblower who filed the complaint against Jason is currently reviewing his statement. "I happen to know that if new evidence comes to light, he might be convinced to formally retract his allegations. The doctored files could simply disappear. Jason's firm would drop the suspension, and his pristine reputation would be entirely restored by Monday morning." The trap was finally sprung. Richard laid out his ultimate demand with chilling clarity. "All you have to do is be a good daughter," Richard stated. "My legal team will be waiting for you in my San Francisco office tomorrow afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock. You will sit down at the conference table and you will sign the conservatorship agreement. You will legally surrender your grandfather's $15 million trust fund into Derek's management, acknowledging that you are mentally unfit to handle your own finances. You sign the papers, Sydney, and Jason gets his life back. If you refuse or if you attempt to fight the injunction in court on Friday, I will personally ensure your husband spends the next decade in a federal penitentiary. The choice is yours." The voicemail ended with a sharp beep, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. I stared at the black screen of my phone. Richard had laid all his cards on the table. He was holding Jason's freedom hostage, demanding a $15 million ransom to pay off the Russian syndicates hunting my brother. He truly believed he had beaten me into submission. He expected me to show up at his corporate office tomorrow, broken, defeated, and ready to sign my life away to save the man I loved. I looked up at Jason. My husband was staring back at me, his jaw set, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce defiance. We did not need to exchange a single word to know exactly what we were going to do. I turned to my computer monitors, the glowing green code of Derek's stolen financial ledgers reflecting in my eyes. Richard wanted me to surrender. He was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to blackmail a cybersecurity architect who holds all the digital keys to your destruction. I stood in the center of my kitchen, a primal, violent rage threatening to tear its way out of my chest. My fingers twitched, ready to unleash a digital plague that would wipe Richard and Derek from the financial grid entirely. I wanted to destroy them right this second. But when I looked at Jason, the white-hot fury in my veins suddenly cooled into a sharp, focused clarity. Jason did not look like a man whose career had just been assassinated. The initial shock had completely evaporated. In its place was the terrifying predatory calm of a senior corporate litigator who had just been handed the keys to his opponent's destruction. He reached over, picked up his phone, and set it gently on the marble counter. "They think they are navigating a messy family dispute," Jason said, his voice smooth and devoid of any panic. "They forgot exactly what I do for a living." Richard just crossed the line from a civil conservatorship battle directly into a coordinated federal crime. Monique leaned against the counter, her forensic accountant instincts immediately locking onto Jason's wavelength. "Extortion," she stated simply. "Blackmail, coercion, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Jason corrected, a cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. "If Richard is leveraging a fabricated state bar complaint to force a financial transaction involving a $15 million trust fund, that is an organized extortion ring. But we cannot just walk into a police station and claim my father-in-law is blackmailing me. We need Bradley to explicitly state the terms of the bribe on the record. We need him to confess the mechanics of the extortion." "Bradley is an arrogant, greedy opportunist," Jason explained, opening his laptop next to mine. "He thinks he just outsmarted a senior partner. He's going to be riding a massive ego trip tonight. If I approach him as a broken, desperate man willing to surrender everything to save my license, he will absolutely take the bait just to gloat." I turned back to my encrypted workstation. "If you can get him on a video call, I can handle the rest," I told my husband. "I will run a background trace on his connection. I will capture the audio log, his internet protocol address, and secure the digital forensics so the recording is entirely admissible in a federal court." Jason quickly drafted an email to a private address he knew Bradley used for off-the-books communications. The message was a masterpiece of legal acting. Jason wrote in disjointed, panicked sentences. He begged for a brief conversation, claiming I was terrified and ready to sign the conservatorship over to my father tomorrow, but that he needed absolute assurance the bar complaint would be fully retracted before we surrendered the $15 million. We waited in tense silence. 9 minutes later, Jason's screen lit up with a secure video meeting link. Bradley had taken the bait. I routed the connection through my quarantined server, running a silent capture protocol in the background. The moment the video feed connected, I locked onto Bradley's geographical location. He was sitting in a high-end hotel room. My tracing software instantly pinpointed the network. He was logged into a luxury casino resort in Las Vegas, Nevada. I tapped Jason's arm and pointed to my screen. "He is out of state," I whispered. Jason's eyes gleamed with absolute triumph. By initiating this extortion demand across state lines over a digital network, Bradley and Richard were no longer just committing a local crime. They had just triggered federal wire fraud statutes. The FBI would now have full jurisdiction. Jason clicked the unmute button and instantly transformed his posture. He slumped his shoulders, dropped his gaze, and ran a shaking hand over his face. He looked utterly defeated. "Bradley," Jason said, his voice cracking with manufactured desperation, "please tell me we can fix this. My wife is in pieces. She will sign whatever Richard wants tomorrow at the 2 o'clock meeting. We just need to know my law license is safe." On the screen, Bradley leaned back in his plush hotel chair, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He looked incredibly smug, completely intoxicated by his own perceived power. "It is a little too late for begging, Jason. You should have thought about this before you fired me. But lucky for you, your father-in-law is a generous man." Jason kept his head bowed. "I need to hear the exact terms, Bradley. If Sydney signs the trust fund over to Derek, how do I know you will actually withdraw the fabricated evidence from the ethics committee? I need a guarantee." "You do not get guarantees," Bradley laughed harshly. "You get to follow instructions. The deal Richard set up is very simple. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Sydney signs the papers granting Derek full control of her grandfather's trust. The second Richard's lawyer verifies her signature, Richard wires me my $500,000 consulting fee. Once the money hits my offshore account, I email the state bar and tell them I suffered a mental breakdown and fabricated the entire embezzlement story because I was bitter about my termination. Your firm gets an apology and your pristine reputation is saved. Everybody wins." Jason let out a long, heavy sigh of fake relief. So Richard is personally paying you $500,000 to frame me just to force Sydney to hand the $15 million over to Derek. That is the price of doing business with the big boys, Bradley sneered. Make sure your wife brings a good pen tomorrow, Jason. Enjoy your night. The screen went black as Bradley ended the call. The moment the connection severed, Jason sat up straight, his defeated posture vanishing instantly. I stopped the recording protocol, encrypting the video audio and the network tracing logs into a secure digital vault. We had him. We had the exact dollar amount of the bribe, the explicit timeline, the names of the co-conspirators, and the direct admission of federal extortion. Jason picked up his cell phone and dialed a number from memory. He did not call the local police. He bypassed state authorities entirely and called Special Agent Mitchell, a senior contact he knew intimately from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division in San Francisco. Mitchell, it is Jason, he said, his voice crisp and professional. I need an emergency secure file transfer protocol. I am sending you a recorded confession detailing a coordinated extortion ring, interstate wire fraud, and a conspiracy to misappropriate a $15 million trust fund. The primary targets are former bank executive Richard and hedge fund manager Derek. The perpetrators are meeting tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the financial district to execute the final stage of the blackmail. Jason listened for a moment, nodding sharply. Yes, I have the digital forensics and the fabricated financial ledgers ready for your team. I will meet your agents at the federal building in 3 hours to formalize the indictment. Jason hung up the phone and looked across the kitchen island at me and Monique. The federal trap is completely locked, Jason announced, a fierce satisfaction settling over his features. The FBI will be waiting for them at the law firm tomorrow afternoon. I have the legal slaughter handled. He leaned over and pressed a kiss to my forehead. Now, my brilliant wife, you need to handle Derek's Russian problem. I turned back to my glowing monitors, pulling up the dark web communication channels Monique had extracted from Derek's hidden servers. The legal battle was Jason's domain, but the financial execution was entirely mine. I began initiating the anonymous protocols, preparing to launch a digital counterattack that would turn my brother into my absolute financial prisoner. The front door clicked shut as Jason left to meet the federal agents, leaving Monique and me alone in the quiet expanse of my kitchen. The digital clock on the wall shifted to 4 in the morning. I had exactly 10 hours before my parents expected me to walk into their San Francisco law firm and sign away my autonomy. They believed they had successfully paralyzed me by freezing my primary bank accounts. They fundamentally misunderstood how a cybersecurity architect builds financial redundancies. I turned back to my encrypted workstation and opened a hidden partition on my hard drive. Richard had used his banking connections to flag my social security number, but he did not know about my emergency corporate credit lines or the shadow capital I had secured when founding my cybersecurity firm. Within 20 minutes, I bypassed his localized freeze by leveraging my company's proprietary software patents to authorize an immediate high-yield commercial loan from an independent tech incubator. I combined this influx of cash with my remaining offshore liquid assets, pooling exactly $1.2 million into a secure digital wallet. I routed the funds through a decentralized cryptocurrency mixer to completely sanitize their origin. Then I deployed an automated legal script to incorporate a blind shell company. I named the entity Vanguard Asset Recovery and registered it in Wyoming, a state renowned for maintaining absolute corporate anonymity. To the outside world, Vanguard was just a faceless, ruthless debt acquisition firm. Monique stepped up beside me, sliding a piece of paper across the marble island. It contained a series of encrypted routing numbers and a dark web onion address. This is the digital drop site Derek used to communicate with his Eastern European investors, Monique said, her voice steady and clinical. They operate through anonymous brokers on a decentralized messaging board. Based on the panic in Derek's decrypted emails, these brokers are currently threatening to liquidate him physically if he does not produce their stolen $8 million by Friday evening. I nodded, launching a secure Tor browser masked behind 3 separate virtual private networks. I pinged the broker's address using the specific cryptographic handshake Monique had extracted from Derek's server. I did not approach them as a terrified sister trying to save her brother. I approached them as a cold, calculating corporate liquidator who specialized in acquiring distressed, high-risk assets from sinking operations. The encrypted chat interface blinked to life on my right monitor. The broker responded instantly, demanding identification. I provided the newly minted credentials for Vanguard Asset Recovery, projecting absolute institutional authority. I typed my message with rapid, unforgiving precision. I informed the anonymous broker that their primary debtor, Derek, had severely compromised his financial standing. I revealed that he was currently under active investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for interstate wire fraud and extortion, and that federal warrants were being drafted by the authorities as we spoke. I dropped enough verified data points from Monique's forensic ledgers to prove my insider knowledge. The digital silence stretched for 4 agonizing minutes. The syndicate was verifying my claims through their own illicit channels. In the criminal underworld, an impending FBI indictment means all connected assets will be frozen, seized, and heavily scrutinized by the United States government. To the syndicate, Derek's $8 million debt was suddenly a massive liability. It was about to become completely worthless. The broker typed back, "They recognized the imminent threat of federal asset forfeiture. They demanded to know what Vanguard Asset Recovery proposed." I laid out my terms with zero hesitation. I offered to buy Derek's entire $8 million debt portfolio, immediately assuming all the federal risk. In exchange for transferring the smart contracts, the digital promissory notes, and the physical collection rights to my LLC, I offered them a flat payout of $800,000 in clean, untraceable cryptocurrency, 10 cents on the dollar. It was a brutal, punishing haircut for the syndicate, but an instantaneous, risk-free cash injection compared to losing the entire sum to a federal freeze. The broker attempted to negotiate, demanding $2 million for the portfolio. I pushed back aggressively. I informed them that the FBI would be raiding Derek's corporate office in less than 12 hours. I stated clearly that the $800,000 was a final, non-negotiable offer that would expire in exactly 5 minutes. If they refused, they could take their chances extracting cash from a man sitting in a federal holding cell. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. Beside me, Monique held her breath. If the syndicate refused the buyout, Derek remained their target, and my ultimate leverage over his existence vanished. 3 minutes passed. The cursor blinked steadily in the dark chat room. The tension in the kitchen was thick enough to suffocate on. Then a long string of cryptographic keys appeared on my screen. They accepted the terms. I executed a pre-written smart contract transfer, sending the $800,000 in cryptocurrency from my sanitized wallet directly to their anonymous ledger. In return, the broker transferred the digital ownership of Derek's massive debt directly to Vanguard Asset Recovery. Monique leaned over the keyboard, quickly running a forensic diagnostic on the incoming files. She verified the cryptographic signatures against her own extracted records. "They are authentic?" She confirmed, a fierce, triumphant smile slowly spreading across her face. "We have the legally binding promissory notes, the recorded extortion threats, and the complete ledger of his financial obligations to the syndicate. It is all fully transferred." The chat window closed permanently, severing the connection to the dark web. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the cool glow of the monitors illuminating the dark kitchen. I pulled up the master ledger on my primary screen. The massive red deficit of $8 million no longer belonged to a violent Eastern European crime syndicate. It belonged entirely to Vanguard Asset Recovery. By extension, it belonged exclusively to me. I did not just have the power to stop the conservatorship. I held the digital leash to my golden child brother's entire existence. He thought he was walking into a corporate boardroom tomorrow afternoon to orchestrate the theft of my $15 million trust fund. He thought he was holding all the cards. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking into a room with his sole creditor and that I officially owned his life. The sun began to rise over the San Francisco skyline, casting long, pale shadows across my kitchen island. I had not slept a single minute, but the sheer adrenaline pulsing through my veins made physical fatigue entirely irrelevant. I had spent the last 2 hours finalizing the digital transfer of Derek's massive debt into my anonymous corporate entity, Vanguard Asset Recovery. Monique was asleep on my living room sofa, having collapsed from sheer exhaustion after we verified the final encrypted ledger. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, the heavy oak front door opened. Jason walked back inside. He looked physically drained but practically vibrated with a sharp, predatory energy. He set his leather briefcase on the table and looked at me. "The FBI has the entire dossier," Jason said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. "Agent Mitchell expedited the warrants. They are actively monitoring the financial wire transfers through a federal tracking program. The exact moment Richard attempts to pay off Bradley to retract the state bar complaint, the feds will execute the sting. The extortion charges are locked in." I nodded, bringing him up to speed on my end of the battlefield. I detailed how I had successfully negotiated with the Russian syndicate and purchased my brother's debt for pennies on the dollar. Jason's eyes widened with a mix of shock and absolute awe as I explained that my shell company was now Derek's sole creditor. We had successfully surrounded my family on all fronts. We had them trapped legally, financially, and federally. At 8:30, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the marble countertop. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. Patricia was an early riser, especially when she was orchestrating a family crisis. She wanted to lock in her victory before the business day officially began. I motioned for Jason to come closer and tapped the speaker icon, accepting the call. "Sydney, darling." Patricia's voice floated out of the speaker. Her tone was dripping with a sickeningly sweet maternal concern that made my skin crawl. It was the exact polished, empathetic voice she used when speaking to her wealthy country club friends about local charity events. "I am so glad you picked up your phone. Your father and I have been up all night worrying about you." I did not speak immediately. I needed her to carry the conversation to overplay her hand and reveal her true intentions. This whole situation has just gotten entirely out of control. My mother sighed heavily, playing the role of the exhausted peacemaker perfectly. "We never wanted things to escalate to this point. You know we love you, Sydney. We just want this terrible nightmare to end, so our family can begin to heal. We hate seeing you and Jason suffer like this." She was dangling Jason's destroyed career in front of me like a piece of raw meat. She was offering a way out, framing their vicious, illegal extortion as a generous olive branch from a loving parent. "Jason is facing permanent disbarment, Mom," I said intentionally, letting my voice waver. I injected just enough panic into my tone to make it sound authentic. "His firm locked him out last night. He could go to prison over these embezzlement charges." "I know, sweetheart. I know, Patricia," cooed her voice laced with weaponized sympathy. "It is an absolute tragedy. But your father believes he can still fix it. The man who filed the complaint against Jason is willing to completely retract his statements if we handle this quietly today. We can make all of Jason's legal problems disappear by this afternoon. But you have to work with us, Sydney. You have to stop fighting your father." It was time to deliver the performance of a lifetime. I closed my eyes and channeled every ounce of fear, exhaustion, and desperation I had ever felt growing up in their toxic household. I let my breathing grow intentionally ragged. I forced a wet, choking sob into the back of my throat, letting my voice break. "I do not know what to do," I cried, allowing the tears to sound thick and heavy. "I cannot lose my company, Mom. And I cannot let Jason go to jail because of me. He worked so hard for his career. This is entirely my fault. I never should have fought you and Dad. I am so tired of fighting." Jason covered his mouth to mask a massive grin, his eyes gleaming with absolute delight at my flawless acting. From the living room, Monique stirred and sat up, listening to the unfolding drama with a hardened, appreciative expression. "Oh, Sydney," Patricia said softly. I could practically hear the triumphant, predatory smile spreading across her face. She truly believed she had broken me. She thought her defiant, difficult daughter was finally submitting to the natural family order. "It is okay to admit when you need help. That is what your father and Derek are here for. You are just overwhelmed, and that is exactly why the conservatorship is the best thing for you right now. You need to step back and let the men handle the complex financial burdens. Will Dad really save Jason's career? I whimpered, making myself sound tiny, defeated, and completely reliant on their mercy. I promise you, Patricia vowed smoothly, sealing her own fate. Your father has the situation entirely under control. We have the legal documents prepared at his San Francisco office. We just need you to be a good girl and sign the trust fund transfer over to Derek. The moment you sign the papers, Jason gets his life back, and you can focus on getting the psychiatric help you desperately need. Okay, I whispered, injecting a final broken sob into the phone's microphone. Okay, Mom. I will sign the papers. I surrender. Just please do not let them take Jason's law license. We will see you at 2 o'clock sharp. Darling, Patricia said cheerfully, having secured her ultimate prize. Dress nicely. We want to put all this ugliness behind us. The line clicked dead, the connection severed. I stood completely motionless for a fraction of a second. Then I dropped my shoulders, cleared my throat, and wiped the fake manufactured tears from the corners of my eyes. The facade of the broken, terrified daughter vanished into thin air, replaced by absolute glacial determination. I looked up. Jason was staring at me with a mixture of profound love and genuine terror, clearly impressed by how effortlessly I had manipulated the master manipulator. Monique walked into the kitchen, crossing her arms over her chest. A fierce, predatory grin spread across her face. I picked up my coffee mug and took a long, calm sip. A cold, remorseless smile curved my lips. My mother thought she had just reeled in a defeated victim. She had no idea she had just invited a digital executioner directly into their corporate boardroom. The federal warrants were signed. The syndicate debt was purchased. The trap was fully and inescapably set. The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor of Richard's law firm, revealing a lobby that reeked of old money and corporate intimidation. Thick mahogany paneling, imported marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay, designed to make anyone stepping off the elevator feel small and insignificant. I did not feel small, I felt like a loaded weapon. The receptionist, a young woman who looked terrified just to be breathing the same air as the senior partners, immediately ushered me toward the main conference room. The heavy double oak doors stood open. Inside, sitting around a massive custom-built mahogany table, was my entire toxic family, flanked by their legal hit squad. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture radiating absolute dominance. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than a mid-sized sedan, looking every inch the ruthless banking executive who had just successfully crushed a rebellion. Patricia sat to his right, her posture perfectly straight, her face arranged in an expression of tragic maternal suffering that deserved an Academy Award. She was wearing pearls. She only ever wore pearls when she wanted to project unimpeachable moral authority. And then there was Derek. He sat next to our mother, trying to project the image of a successful hedge fund manager, but the cracks in his facade were glaringly obvious. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sheer terror of a man running from Russian debt collectors. His hands were folded tightly on the table, likely to hide their trembling. He was sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning in the room. He needed this $15 million trust fund today, or he was a dead man. Flanking the family were two extremely expensive-looking lawyers. They watched me walk in with the cold, detached expressions of men who destroyed lives for a hefty hourly rate. "Ah," Sidney Richard announced, his voice booming across the polished wood table. His tone was perfectly calibrated to sound like a magnanimous victor greeting a defeated opponent. "We are so glad you decided to be sensible. Please take a seat." I walked slowly into the room, my footsteps muted by the plush Persian rug. I chose a chair directly opposite my father, ignoring the hostile glares from my mother and brother. I sat down, placed my sleek leather portfolio on the table, and folded my hands over it. I maintained absolute eye contact with Richard, refusing to shrink under his intense, intimidating gaze. Patricia let out a long, theatrical sigh and leaned forward, adopting her most condescending maternal tone. "Sidney, darling." We want you to know how difficult this has been for all of us. No parent ever wants to be in a position where they have to legally intervene in their child's life. But after the horrific events at the wedding, and seeing how rapidly your mental state has deteriorated, we simply had no other choice. She reached out and briefly touched Derek's arm, a grotesque display of solidarity with the man who had actively tried to poison me. "We love you, Sydney," Patricia continued, her voice dripping with weaponized pity. "But you are clearly a danger to yourself and others. Hacking into private security feeds displaying such intense paranoia, it broke my heart to realize how sick you have become. This conservatorship is not a punishment. It is an intervention. We are doing this to protect you from yourself. Once Derek assumes control of the trust, you will not have to worry about complex financial burdens anymore. You can finally get the serious psychiatric help you so desperately need." The sheer audacity of her performance was breathtaking. She was sitting in a room filled with corporate lawyers actively orchestrating a $15 million theft and framing it as an act of profound maternal love. She truly believed her own narrative. She believed that because she was wealthy and powerful, she could simply redefine reality to suit her needs. Richard signaled to the senior lawyer on his left. The lawyer slid a thick stack of legal documents across the mahogany table. The pages stopped directly in front of my folded hands. "These are the voluntary conservatorship agreements," the lawyer stated, his voice a low, authoritative drone. "By signing these documents, you are formally acknowledging that you are currently experiencing a severe psychological episode and are legally incompetent to manage your own financial affairs. You are voluntarily surrendering the execution of your grandfather's trust to your father, Richard, who will immediately transfer the management of all $15 million to your brother, Derek." The lawyer tapped a gold pen against the top page. "In exchange for your voluntary signature, your father has agreed to withdraw the emergency ex parte injunction currently freezing your corporate and personal accounts. Furthermore, your father has agreed to cover the full cost of a residential psychiatric facility of his choosing." The trap was laid out in plain English. Sign away $15 million, admit to being legally insane, and submit to being locked in a mental institution controlled by the very people who tried to destroy me. I looked down at the documents, then back up at my family. Derek was practically vibrating in his chair, his eyes fixed hungrily on the signature line. He was seconds away from paying off the syndicate and saving his own life. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out my own pen. I did not take the cap off. I simply rolled it between my fingers, letting the silence stretch out, forcing them to wait. Richard shifted impatiently. "Sign the papers, Sydney. We have a notary waiting outside. Let us get this ugly business finished so we can all move forward." I placed the pen down on top of the legal documents. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "I understand the mechanics of the conservatorship," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "I understand that you want control of the $15 million trust. But before I sign a document admitting that I am legally incompetent, I need you to clarify something for me, Richard." My father frowned, his dark eyes narrowing. "Clarify what? The terms are explicit." "Terms are... I need you to clarify the exact nature of the leverage you are using to force my signature today," I stated, locking my gaze onto his. "Because we all know this has absolutely nothing to do with my mental health. I want to hear you say it on the record in front of your legal counsel. Why exactly do I need to sign these papers right now?" The tension in the room spiked instantly. The lawyers exchanged a sharp, wary glance. They were paid to orchestrate complex legal maneuvers, but my direct, aggressive questioning was deviating significantly from the script they had prepared. Richard let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. "Do not play games, Sydney. You are signing these papers because you are unstable and unfit." I shook my head slowly, maintaining absolute eye contact. "No, Richard. I am sitting in this chair because you threatened my husband. I am sitting here because you paid a disgraced former paralegal named Bradley $500,000 to fabricate federal wire fraud charges against Jason." Patricia gasped, a sharp intake of breath that echoed loudly in the silent room. Derek flinched, his eyes darting toward the door as if looking for an escape route. The lawyers immediately sat up straighter, their professional detachment vanishing entirely. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy mahogany table. I am not signing anything until you admit exactly what this is. You are holding Jason's law license hostage. You promised that if I sign away the $15 million to Derek, Bradley will retract his fabricated ethics complaint, and Jason's career will be saved. I want you to confirm the terms of the extortion, Richard. Say it. The conference room descended into a deadly, suffocating silence. I had just laid out the exact mechanics of a federal crime in front of two senior partners at a major law firm. I was pushing my father into a corner, baiting his massive ego and waiting for his arrogance to override his legal instincts. I knew he could not resist the urge to assert his absolute dominance. I just needed him to speak the words aloud. The senior lawyer immediately raised his hands, his face flashing with genuine legal panic. Richard very strongly advised against answering that. The lawyer warned, his voice tight. We are here solely to discuss the voluntary conservatorship. Any other matters are entirely outside the purview of this firm. I let my shoulders slump, perfectly mimicking the posture of a terrified, cornered animal. I looked down at the gold pen resting on the thick stack of papers. Then I cannot sign. I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. If you cannot guarantee Jason is safe, I have no reason to surrender the money. You could take the $15 million and still let him go to prison. Derek slammed his fist against the mahogany table. The sudden noise made Patricia jump. Just tell her. Dad, Derek snapped. He was sweating profusely now, his eyes darting frantically to the antique clock on the wall. The Russian syndicate's deadline was closing in, and my brother was suffocating under the pressure. Tell her the deal so we can get this over with. We do not have time for her dramatic games. I looked up at Derek, letting a tear well in my eye. I am not playing games, Derek, I said, my voice cracking. I am terrified. I just need to hear it from Dad. I need to know that if I give you the trust fund, the state bar complaint against my husband will actually disappear. Please, just explain it to me simply. Richard sneered, entirely unable to resist the opportunity to flex his absolute dominance. The lawyers tried to intervene again, but Richard silenced them with a sharp, vicious gesture. In his mind, he was the king of San Francisco, and the attorneys were just hired help. He wanted to look me in the eye and make sure I understood exactly how thoroughly he had crushed me. You really need it spelled out for you, Sydney? Richard asked, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. Fine, I will explain the mechanics of your defeat. The moment your signature is on that document, granting Derek full access to the $15 million, I will authorize a wire transfer of $500,000 to Bradley's offshore account. Bradley has already drafted an official retraction. He will send it directly to the Ethics Committee, stating he fabricated the embezzlement evidence because he was a bitter, terminated employee. The investigation into Jason will be closed before the weekend. His career will be spotless. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, pressing my thumb against the small concealed transmitter hidden beneath the heavy silk fabric of my dress. Every single syllable Richard spoke was currently broadcasting in crystal-clear audio to Jason, who was standing in the lobby downstairs alongside two federal agents. So the entire bar complaint was a coordinated setup, I asked, maintaining the frightened facade. You and Derek paid him to frame Jason just to force me to sign these papers. It was a necessary business strategy, Derek interjected loudly, desperate to validate his own criminal actions. You were being stubborn. We needed leverage to secure the trust fund today. You brought this on yourself, Sydney. Patricia nodded in agreement, smoothing her pearls. We are protecting the family legacy. Jason is acceptable collateral damage if it means keeping the wealth where it belongs. I had it. The audio recording was flawless. The extortion, the conspiracy, the bribery, and the explicit financial demands were now securely logged on federal servers. The air in the room felt incredibly still. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background. I looked at the gold pen resting on the legal documents. I looked at Patricia's smug satisfaction, Richard's arrogant dominance, and Derek's desperate, hungry anticipation. I reached out and picked up the pen. Derek leaned forward, his eyes tracking my hand like a starving predator watching a meal. Richard smiled, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, completely satisfied with his victory. I held the pen over the signature line. I let the tip hover just a millimeter above the paper. I held the pose for 5 agonizing seconds, letting the silence stretch until it was practically deafening. Then I casually tossed the pen across the room. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor and rolled away into a corner. I sat back, crossed my legs, and dropped the terrified victim routine entirely. A cold, predatory smile spread across my face. "I am not signing anything," I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was sharp, authoritative, and utterly remorseless. The reaction was instantaneous. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Richard bolted upright, his face instantly turning a violent shade of purple. The high-priced lawyers looked completely bewildered by the sudden drastic shift in my demeanor. "What did you just say?" Richard demanded, his voice a dangerous, booming roar. "I said I am not signing your papers, Richard," I replied, staring him down with absolute chilling calm. "And you are never touching a single cent of my $15 million. Derek completely lost his mind. The realization that his payday was gone and the Russian syndicate was coming for his life snapped his fragile sanity in half. He let out a guttural, frantic scream. He threw his chair backward and lunged violently across the massive mahogany table, his hands reaching directly for my throat. He scrambled over the polished wood, knocking over crystal water glasses and scattering the legal documents in a desperate, animalistic attack. I did not flinch. I did not move. I just watched him scramble toward me. Before his outstretched fingers could reach my neck, the heavy oak doors of the conference room were kicked open with earth-shattering force. The heavy oak doors did not just swing open. They were violently forced apart, slamming against the mahogany-paneled walls with a thunderous crack that shook the glass water pitchers on the long table. Derek froze in midair, his knee planted on the polished wood, his hands hovering mere inches from my throat. Monique strode into the room. She was no longer the quiet, accommodating daughter-in-law my parents had ignored for half a decade. She wore a sharp, tailored crimson suit, her heels clicking against the hardwood with the rhythmic, terrifying cadence of an executioner. Flanking her were 2 imposing federal agents, wearing tactical vests adorned with bold yellow FBI lettering, their hands resting cautiously near their holstered sidearms. Right behind them stood 3 stern individuals in conservative gray suits, their identification badges clearly marking them as senior investigators for the Securities and Exchange Commission. Richard dropped back into his leather chair, the blood instantly draining from his face. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her pearl necklace, as if the jewelry could somehow protect her from a federal raid. The 2 highly paid corporate attorneys representing my father immediately stood up, raised their hands, and physically backed away from the table. They instantly recognized that this had just escalated from a civil family dispute into a federal criminal takedown. They wanted absolutely no part of the blast radius. Derek scrambled backward, slipping on the scattered legal documents and tumbling awkwardly off the table onto the floor. He scrambled to his feet, panting heavily, his eyes darting frantically between his wife and the armed agents blocking the only exit. Monique, Derek stammered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "What are you doing? Who are these people?" Monique did not say a word at first. She marched directly up to my brother, closing the distance until she was inches from his face. She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick legal document bound in a blue cover. With a swift, practiced motion, she slapped the stack of papers directly against Derek's chest. He reflexively grabbed them before they hit the floor. "Those are the divorce papers," Monique stated, her voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "I am claiming full custody of our children. I am freezing our joint assets, and I am officially cutting you out of my life, you pathetic, scamming coward." Before Derek could even process the divorce filing, Monique reached back into her tote. She pulled out a massive 4-inch thick binder packed with financial ledgers, highlighted transaction logs, and printed blockchain tracking charts. She slammed the enormous binder onto the mahogany table with a force that made Patricia flinch in her seat. And that Monique continued pointing a manicured finger at the binder, is the complete unredacted forensic accounting of your entire fake cryptocurrency hedge fund. I spent the last 48 hours ripping through your pathetic factory default firewalls with your sister. I traced every single offshore shell company you registered in Cyprus. I followed the money trail of the $8 million you stole from your investors and lost in a highly leveraged catastrophic short position 4 weeks ago. Richard tried to intervene, his voice completely stripped of its usual commanding boom. Monique, wait. Let us be reasonable. We can handle this internally as a family. Monique whipped her head around, fixing my father with a glare so intense it practically scorched the air. We are not family, Richard. You and Patricia made sure of that every single Thanksgiving when you seated me near the kitchen and introduced me simply as Derek's wife, completely erasing my entire career as a partner at a forensic accounting firm. You treated me like a diversity prop to impress your wealthy country club friends while harboring your quiet, suffocating racism. You underestimated me. You thought I was just going to sit quietly and smile while you protected a criminal. You were completely wrong. One of the SEC investigators stepped forward, pulling a clipboard from his briefcase. Derek, we have secured a federal warrant to seize all servers' digital wallets and physical assets associated with your firm. You are currently under investigation for massive securities fraud, operating an unlicensed exchange, and misappropriation of client funds. The walls were rapidly closing in on my brother. The Russian syndicate was hunting him for the $8 million. The FBI was standing in the doorway for the extortion conspiracy. The SEC was seizing his fraudulent company. His wife had just served him divorce papers and handed his entire criminal ledger directly to the federal government. Derek snapped. His fragile ego, built on decades of parental coddling and unearned entitlement, completely shattered under the weight of his undeniable reality. It is all fake, Derek screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he pointed wildly at the binder. She made it all up. She is just an angry, vindictive accountant trying to ruin me because I wanted a divorce. You cannot prove any of this. It is entirely circumstantial. You do not have the private keys to my wallets. You do not have the transaction hashes. You have absolutely no proof that I owe anyone a single dime. Derek turned to the FBI agents, his chest heaving as he frantically tried to spin a new web of lies. They are lying. Sydney and Monique orchestrated this entire thing to steal my company. You have zero concrete proof of my debt. The room went dead silent. Only Derek's frantic, ragged breathing could be heard echoing off the expensive wood paneling. He thought he had found a technical loophole. He believed that because cryptocurrency was decentralized, the federal agents could never definitively link the $8 million deficit directly to the Russian syndicate without the specific digital contracts. He thought he could still lie his way out of the trap, relying on the complex anonymity of the blockchain to shield his crimes. I looked at Monique. She smiled a sharp, brilliant expression of pure victory and took a slow step back to clear the stage. I placed both hands flat on the polished mahogany table and pushed myself up from my chair. I smoothed the front of my dress, maintaining absolute terrifying calm as I stood up to finally face my brother. You are incredibly arrogant to assume I would walk into this room without holding the master key, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the conference room like a blade. You thought you could hide behind the decentralized nature of the blockchain. You genuinely believed that without the private cryptographic keys, the federal government could never definitively prove. The $8 million deficit belonged to you. I reached down and picked up the sleek leather portfolio I had placed on the mahogany table when I first arrived. I unzipped the main compartment with a slow, deliberate motion. I withdrew a single heavy manila folder. You are entirely correct about one thing, Derek. I continued, holding the folder in my hands. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not have the private keys to the Russian syndicate's digital ledger this morning. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not have the original smart contracts detailing your catastrophic, highly leveraged short position. They did not have the physical proof of your debt. I tossed the thick manila folder across the polished wood. It slid rapidly across the long table, stopping exactly 1 inch from Derek's trembling fingers. But I stated. Derek stared down at the closed folder as if it were a live explosive. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat, but he refused to open it. Go ahead, I instructed, gesturing toward the documents. Open it. Read the incorporation papers for a Wyoming holding company called Vanguard Asset Recovery. Read the decrypted dark web chat logs from 4 o'clock this morning. Look at the digital transfer receipts verifying a massive cryptocurrency transaction between Vanguard Asset Recovery and the anonymous broker representing your Eastern European investors. My brother's hands shook violently as he flipped open the heavy cover of the folder. His eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the undeniable, meticulously documented proof of his own financial execution. When your investors realized that a federal raid on your company was imminent, they panicked, I explained, pacing slowly behind my chair. They knew the United States government would freeze your assets, rendering your $8 million debt completely uncollectible. So Vanguard Asset Recovery offered them a harsh but guaranteed bailout. I purchased your entire debt portfolio, complete with the original smart contracts, the digital promissory notes, and the cryptographic keys. I bought your life for 10 cents on the dollar. Derek looked up from the folder, the remaining blood completely draining from his face. His breathing became shallow, rapid gasps. You do not owe the Russians any more, Derek, I said, leaning forward and placing my palms flat on the table, bringing my face level with his. You owe me $8 million, and I am collecting today. A sickening, suffocating realization crashed over my golden child brother. He was not just facing federal prison. He was entirely financially tethered to the sister he had spent his entire life abusing. By purchasing the debt directly from the syndicate, I had legally acquired the exact cryptographic proof the federal agents needed to secure a conviction for massive securities fraud. I had locked the door to his digital cage, and I had handed the key directly to the authorities. Before Derek could even process the magnitude of his destruction, heavy footsteps echoed from the marble lobby outside. The federal agent standing by the doorway stepped aside respectfully. Jason walked into the conference room. My husband did not look like a man whose career had been suspended. He looked immaculate, wearing his sharpest navy suit, his posture radiating the terrifying, commanding presence of a senior corporate litigator who had just won the biggest case of his life. He held a stack of official blue-backed legal documents in his right hand. Jason bypassed Derek entirely and walked straight toward the head of the table. He stopped directly in front of my father. Richard looked up at my husband, his jaw clenched tight. You have no jurisdiction here, Richard growled, attempting one last pathetic display of alpha male dominance. You are a disgraced, suspended attorney facing permanent disbarment. Get out of my firm. I am not here acting as legal counsel, Richard Jason replied, his voice echoing with absolute authority. I am here as a cooperating witness for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jason dropped the heavy stack of documents directly onto the table in front of my father. Those are federal warrants for conspiracy, extortion, and interstate wire fraud, Jason stated coldly. You made a fatal miscalculation last night, Richard. When you instructed your hired paralegal Bradley to extort me across state lines, you triggered federal statutes. And when you decided to leave a gloating voicemail on my wife's phone explicitly detailing the terms of the blackmail, you handed us the exact recorded confession we needed to authorize a federal sting. Richard stared at the warrants. The bold black typography of the United States District Court glared back at him. We recorded the video call with Bradley. Jason continued, twisting the knife. He admitted on tape that you paid him $500,000 to fabricate the embezzlement charges against me. He admitted that the sole purpose of the bar complaint was to terrorize Sydney into surrendering her $15 million trust fund today at 2 o'clock. The federal agents are executing a search warrant on Bradley's hotel room in Las Vegas right now. My law license has been fully reinstated, and the ethics committee is currently drafting a formal apology to my firm. The arrogant, impenetrable facade of the wealthy banking executive shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Richard's breathing hitched. His hand flew to his chest, clutching the lapel of his expensive suit as a sudden sharp pain radiated through his sternum. The terrifying reality of spending the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary crashed over him. He sank heavily into his leather chair, gasping for air, his face turning a dangerous shade of gray. Patricia completely lost her mind. No! My mother screamed, her voice tearing through the room in a shrill, hysterical pitch. "This is a mistake. Richard, do something. Tell them this is a misunderstanding." Patricia frantically turned toward the two highly paid corporate lawyers who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the table. "Do your jobs!" Patricia shrieked, pointing frantically at Jason and the federal agents. "Stop them! File an injunction! You work for us!" The senior lawyer calmly stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and picked up his leather briefcase. Mrs. Patricia, the lawyer, said, his voice entirely stripped of any professional courtesy. "Our firm was retained to process a voluntary family conservatorship. We were not informed that we were being utilized to facilitate federal extortion, wire fraud, or the laundering of stolen cryptocurrency funds. This constitutes a massive conflict of interest. We no longer represent you, Richard or Derek, in any capacity. We highly advise you to retain criminal defense attorneys immediately." The lawyers turned and walked out of the room, completely abandoning my parents to the federal authorities. Patricia let out a loud, piercing wail of pure despair. She dropped her face into her hands, her pearl necklace catching on her trembling fingers as she sobbed. Her pristine social standing, her wealthy country club life, and her entire false reality were burning to the ground right in front of her. Derek looked at his mother, sobbing uncontrollably. He looked at his father, clutching his chest in the midst of a severe medical episode. He looked at Monique, standing triumphantly with the divorce papers, and he looked at me, holding the undeniable proof of his $8 million debt. The golden child realized absolutely no one was coming to save him. Panic overtook his entire nervous system. Derek let out a sharp, terrified sound, scrambled backward away from the mahogany table, and turned to run. He bolted blindly toward the open conference room doors, desperately trying to flee the consequences of his own actions. Derek did not make it past the threshold. He bolted toward the exit with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a cornered animal, completely forgetting that two armed federal agents were actively blocking the only way out. Agent Mitchell did not even draw his weapon. He simply stepped into the doorway, planted his boots, and let my brother's own momentum do the work. Mitchell caught Derek by the lapels of his expensive Italian suit, effortlessly redirecting his panicked flight. With a swift, practiced motion, the agent spun Derek around and slammed him face first against the heavy oak paneling of the conference room doors. The dull thud echoed through the room, immediately followed by the sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs locking tightly around my brother's wrists. Derek let out a pathetic, high-pitched sob, his face pressed against the wood, completely stripped of his arrogant, golden child persona. He sounded like a terrified little boy crying for a mother who could no longer protect him. Across the room, the second FBI agent approached the head of the mahogany table. Richard was still slouched in his leather executive chair, clutching his chest and gasping for air. The agent remained entirely unimpressed by the medical theater. He pulled Richard's arms forward, snapping a pair of handcuffs securely over my father's wrists. The agent calmly informed Richard that an ambulance was en route to evaluate his chest pains, but made it absolutely clear that my father was officially in federal custody for conspiracy to commit extortion and wire fraud. Patricia watched her perfect, carefully constructed universe disintegrate in a matter of seconds. She wailed a shrill, piercing sound of pure devastation, collapsing onto the plush Persian rug as the agents read her husband and son their Miranda rights. I stood next to Jason and Monique, watching the authorities march my family out of their own citadel of power in disgrace. It was the most beautiful, satisfying sequence of events I had ever witnessed. Fast forward 3 weeks, and the fallout was absolutely biblical. The digital and financial bloodbath I initiated had completely consumed them. The federal indictments dropped with devastating force, and the media descended like starving vultures. The financial press had a field day with the story. Major business publications ran front-page exposes detailing the massive crypto fraud. Headlines blared across the internet exposing the former banking executive and his hedge fund manager's son as desperate criminals who tried to blackmail their own family to pay off a Russian crime syndicate. The offshore shell companies, the doctored paralegal reports, and the fake ledgers were all laid bare for the public to scrutinize. Derek was denied bail, deemed a severe flight risk due to his connections with international money launderers. He was sitting in a federal holding cell, trading his tailored suits for a standard-issue jumpsuit. Richard was granted medical release to a secure facility, but the federal government immediately froze every single one of his domestic and international bank accounts under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. With her husband and son locked away and their assets seized by the federal government, Patricia was left entirely alone to face the brutal reality of their actions. The bank moved with ruthless efficiency. Because Richard had leveraged their sprawling San Francisco mansion to quietly cover Derek's earlier smaller losses, the property went into immediate default. Patricia was served with an eviction notice, but the loss of her physical home was absolutely nothing compared to the complete loss of her social status. Patricia had spent decades clawing her way to the absolute top of the local elite. Her entire identity was wrapped up in her position as the president of the most exclusive homeowners association in the Bay Area, and her status at the private country club. She ruled those organizations with an iron fist, constantly judging others and demanding absolute perfection. The moment the federal indictments hit the news, her wealthy friends completely abandoned her. The Homeowners Association called an emergency, highly publicized board meeting. They did not just ask Patricia to step down. They formally and publicly expelled her from the community for bringing criminal disrepute to their neighborhood. The country club immediately revoked her membership. I watched the local news footage of my mother being forced to pack her designer bags into a cheap rental car, escorted off the manicured property by the very private security guards she used to command. Her former friends and neighbors stood on their pristine lawns, whispering and turning their backs as she drove away in total disgrace. She had lost the only thing she truly valued. She was a total social pariah, completely erased from the high society she had worshipped her entire life. Meanwhile, Jason and I were thriving. The $15 million trust fund had transferred flawlessly into my secure accounts. Jason had successfully opened his own boutique corporate law firm, bringing his most loyal clients with him. Monique had finalized her divorce, securing full custody of her children and taking a lucrative position as a lead forensic investigator for the state. We had excised the cancer from our lives and healed stronger than ever. On a quiet Thursday evening, I was sitting on the deck of my new home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and violet. My phone vibrated on the glass table. It was a text message from an unknown number, but the frantic, desperate tone was unmistakable. "Sydney, please. It is your mother. I am staying in a cheap motel and my credit cards are all declining. The lawyers will not return my calls. I have absolutely nothing left. I know we made terrible mistakes, but I am still your mother. Please, I just need a small loan to get on my feet, just enough to find an apartment. I am begging you. Do not leave me out here like this." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the pathetic, begging words of the woman who had happily plotted to drug me, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and steal my future. She was attempting to play the maternal card one last time, hoping my basic human empathy would override her monumental betrayal. I did not type a single word in response. I did not offer her a lecture, an apology, or a piece of my mind. I simply opened the photo gallery on my phone, selected a very specific image I had saved from the night of my wedding, and hit send. It was a high-definition screenshot of my digital watch displaying a bright, bold 50-minute timer counting down to 0. I locked my screen, blocked the number permanently, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my champagne. The following Monday, the bureaucratic fortress Richard had built around my grandfather's estate completely evaporated. With my father facing a multi-count federal indictment and the morality clause exposed as an extortion tool, the probate court moved with unprecedented velocity. At exactly 9 a.m, the $15 million trust fund transferred seamlessly into my highly secured, diversified accounts. I did not celebrate by purchasing a fleet of luxury cars or a massive yacht. Instead, I immediately routed the capital into impenetrable digital vaults and high-yield investments, locking it behind cryptographic firewalls that absolutely no one but me could ever access. I had secured my financial independence permanently. Jason's exoneration was equally swift and profoundly satisfying. The State Bar Ethics Committee, absolutely terrified of being implicated in an ongoing federal extortion ring, cleared his record entirely and issued a formal apology. The managing partners at his former law firm scrambled to do damage control. They called Jason into a private meeting, offering him a highly lucrative senior partnership and a massive signing bonus to smooth things over and prevent any retaliatory lawsuits. Jason listened to their desperate pitch, politely declined their offer, and walked out of their glass-paneled building without a second glance. The very next day, he signed the lease for his own boutique corporate law practice in a sleek office downtown. He took his most valuable and loyal clients with him, building a firm founded on absolute legal integrity rather than ruthless manipulation. Watching him hang his own name on the door was one of the most intensely proud moments of my life. We had survived their worst attack and emerged infinitely stronger. 2 months after the FBI raid tore my biological family apart, I met my sister-in-law for lunch at a high-end bistro overlooking the bay. Monique looked absolutely radiant. She had completely shed the muted conservative wardrobe Patricia had always pressured her to wear at family gatherings. She was thriving in her new role as a lead state forensic investigator, finalizing the absolute last of the divorce proceedings against Derek from a position of undeniable power. She had won full custody of her children, and Derek was currently negotiating a plea deal that would keep him behind federal bars for at least a decade. After we ordered our food, I reached into my leather tote bag and slid a thick blue folder across the table toward her. Monique looked at it suspiciously, her sharp forensic accounting instincts immediately kicking in. I gestured for her to open it. Inside the folder were the confirmation documents for 2 fully funded irrevocable educational trusts I had established that morning. I had allocated a significant portion of my inheritance to guarantee that my niece and nephew would never have to worry about their future. I had structured the trusts to ensure they would never rely on student loans, predatory lenders, or the highly toxic conditional strings attached to any remaining family money. Their undergraduate and graduate degrees were completely financially secured. Monique stared at the account balances on the official bank letterhead, her eyes widening with profound shock. She shook her head, trying to push the folder back across the table, claiming it was entirely too much money and she could not possibly accept it. I stopped her by placing my hand firmly over hers. I told her that my parents had spent their entire lives using wealth as a weapon. They used money to force compliance, to demand loyalty, and to brutally punish any sign of independence. I refused to carry on that toxic legacy. I wanted to use my wealth as a shield. Monique had risked her prestigious career, her personal safety, and her marriage to protect me, when my own blood tried to destroy my sanity and steal my future. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that true family is not determined by shared DNA or superficial holiday dinners. True family is forged in the trenches. It is defined entirely by who stands beside you when the world is trying to tear you down. She accepted the folders, tears streaming freely down her face, and we shared a toast to breaking generational curses and protecting our own. Later that evening, I sat on the expansive cedar deck of the new home Jason and I had recently purchased. It was a modern, secure fortress tucked into the hills overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I had personally designed the security architecture for the entire property, ensuring we had absolute privacy and total control over our environment. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of salt and coastal pine. There were no hidden threats, no manipulative relatives, and no looming disasters hovering over our future. For the first time in 33 years, I felt a profound, untouchable peace settling into my bones. Jason walked out onto the deck carrying 2 glasses of our favorite vintage wine. He handed me one, leaning down to press a soft kiss to the top of my head before sitting in the chair beside me. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip slowly below the horizon, painting the sky in fierce, brilliant strokes of crimson and gold. We did not need to talk about Richard sitting in a federal holding cell or Patricia wandering the halls of a cheap motel. Their existence had been permanently deleted from our system. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my wine. I looked out over the vast, darkening ocean, feeling the cool breeze against my face. My family had looked at me and seen a target. They thought I was just a quiet, isolated girl who spent too much time hiding behind computer screens. They thought my introversion made me weak, and they assumed my silence was a symptom of fragility. They fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of my profession and the calculating architecture of my mind. I build digital walls to keep predators out, but I also know exactly how to tear those walls down when the threat is already standing inside the house. When you back a hacker into a corner, you shouldn't be surprised when you end up in the digital grave you dug yourself. The most profound lesson here is that blood does not equate to family. We are often conditioned to offer unconditional loyalty to our relatives, even when they give us nothing but manipulation and conditional love in return. The ultimate victory isn't necessarily found in seeking revenge, but in realizing you hold the power to simply walk away. True security comes from setting unbreakable boundaries and choosing to surround yourself with people who actually value your worth, rather than those who try to tear it down. Have you ever had to cut ties to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.